Hello friends. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time and your help would mean a lot. If you're watching this video right now, please hit the like button, leave any comment, and support the video. If everyone watching does this, it would really help me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I accepted the position as a ranger in the Appalachian Forest for reasons I didn't fully understand then. The money was adequate but not exceptional. The isolation was profound. The work was routine. Trail maintenance, fire prevention, the occasional search and rescue that usually ended with a lost hiker sheepishly admitting they'd wandered off the marked path. But when the hiring manager asked why I wanted the job, I found myself saying something I'd rehearsed but never quite believed. I needed to disappear for a while. My name is Dakota Reeves. My mother gave me a name that meant friend to everyone because she believed people were inherently good, that community was everything. She died before I could tell her how wrong she was about that. I was 34 years old, recently separated, no children, and carrying the kind of silence that only comes from having spent too much time listening to your own thoughts. The ranger station sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road, nestled at the base of Cannonball Ridge where the forest thickened into something almost prehistoric. My cabin was constructed in the 1960s, solid wood, stone chimney, a porch that sagged toward the creek that ran behind it. There was a generator, propane for heat, and a satellite phone that worked when it wanted to. The Lake Mirror Basin lay 2 miles north, through dense oak and hickory. Rangers were supposed to check the perimeter weekly, maintain the observation points, and respond to emergencies. My supervisor was a man named Vess who visited twice monthly and seemed permanently disappointed that I was doing the job correctly. He had the bearing of someone who'd never been surprised by anything and took no pleasure in his work. Remote posts require documentation, he said during our first meeting. You'll file reports weekly. Any unusual activity, weather events, animal behavior, structural damage gets reported within 24 hours. Unusual how? I asked. You'll know it when you see it, he said, which was his way of admitting he'd never seen it either. The first month passed in the kind of rhythm that makes time feel almost meaningless. I hiked the trails twice weekly, clearing deadfall, noting erosion patterns, checking the 3 observation decks that overlooked the valley. The weather was still warm, that false Indian summer that settles into the southern Appalachians in late September. At night, I sat on the porch and watched the ridgeline change color with the shifting light. It was during the 5th week that I found the first sign something was wrong. The creek behind the cabin runs clear and fast over smooth stones, and I'd fallen into the habit of washing my clothes there rather than using the cabin's finicky plumbing. It was a Sunday morning, the sky still gray, when I noticed the prints on the bank. They were large, pressed deep into the soft mud near the water's edge. At first I thought bear, the size was consistent with a black bear's tracks. But something about the pattern was wrong. The spacing between prints suggested a gait that was almost bipedal but not quite. The front paw marks showed what might have been 5 toes, but the rear prints were ambiguous in a way that made my chest tighten. I took photographs with my phone, though I knew the resolution would be poor. I measured them using a ruler from the cabin, 12 inches across, 4 sets of prints tracking downstream before disappearing at a rocky section where the creek widened. In my report to Vess, I listed it as possible bear activity and noted the location. He replied with a terse email, common, continue monitoring, but I did more than monitor. Over the next week, I found similar prints in 3 other locations. Once along the main trail to Mirror Basin pressed into the soft soil beside a fallen birch. Once near the northern observation point, this time too degraded to photograph clearly. And once, in the most unsettling discovery, circling the cabin itself. The prints circled the cabin completely, passing beneath each window. They lingered at the west side, near my bedroom, for a distance of nearly 20 feet before continuing around the back. I stopped filing these reports. Instead, I began keeping a separate log. Personal documentation that I told myself was just habit, just the kind of observational record that any naturalist might keep. The truth was that something in those prints unsettled me in a way that had nothing to do with wildlife biology. That night, I sat with the cabin door locked and the generator running, the radio playing low-volume static from a station in West Virginia. Outside, the forest breathed in that particular way of early autumn, leaves sliding downward, invisible in the darkness, creating a soft percussion against the cabin roof. I thought about calling Vess. I thought about requesting a transfer. Instead, I sat in the dark of the cabin's main room and listened to the sounds that had begun to feel less like normal forest noise and more like something intentional. The deliberate step on gravel, the pause, the sound of something heavy shifting its weight from one foot to the other. By midnight, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. By 2 in the morning, I'd stopped convincing myself of anything at all. The next day, with the kind of determination that feels like bravery but is actually just avoidance, I decided to hike north to Mira Basin and conduct a formal survey of the water station. The observation platform there was elevated 15 feet above the shoreline, designed for monitoring wildlife patterns and water quality. The hike took 90 minutes through terrain that was becoming increasingly familiar. The trail followed the creek upstream, winding through sections where the canopy was so dense that midday felt like dusk. The forest floor was carpeted with leaf litter, soft and muffled, deadening sound in a way that made my own footsteps feel loud despite my care in stepping quietly. I'd covered maybe a mile when I noticed the first thing that didn't belong to the normal landscape: a deer, hanging from a tree branch. It was positioned about 15 feet up, snagged on a thick oak limb that jutted horizontally from the trunk. The animal was fresh, maybe a day dead, the fur still sleek, but the way it had been placed, impaled through the abdomen on a broken branch, suggested something that didn't fit into any wildlife pattern I understood. No predator kills like this. There's no evolutionary advantage to placement, to display. I stood beneath the tree for a long time, calculating possibilities. A previous kill site, a coyote or wild dog might drag and position a kill to conceal it from scavengers, but the height, the specific impalement, that required deliberation, manipulation, thought. I photographed it and continued hiking. The forest felt different now. The light seemed to move in strange ways, and I became aware of how completely alone I was. The nearest human habitation was the ranger station, which I'd left 3 hours ago on foot. Cell service was non-existent here. If I fell, if I twisted an ankle, if anything happened, the forest would simply continue existing around me until someone noticed I hadn't filed a report. I reached Mirror Basin near noon. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the overcast sky so accurately that the horizon seemed to dissolve. The observation platform was intact, weathered but functional. I climbed the metal stairs, and from the elevated position I could see the full circumference of the lake. That's when I noticed the marks on the far shore. They were visible even from a distance. Deep gouges in the earth, as if something heavy had been dragged from the water. The marks extended upward in parallel lines, furrowing the soft bank. Whatever had emerged from the lake was large and had been pulling itself with significant force. I don't remember deciding to investigate further. I remember standing on the platform, listening to the wind move through the trees around the lake and hearing something else beneath it. A sound that might have been my own breathing amplified by panic, or might have been something further away. Something breathing in synchronization with my own breaths. The hike around to the far shore took 40 minutes. As I approached, the gouges became clearer. They extended 20 feet from the waterline before stopping abruptly in a clear area of moss and low grass. The disturbance was centered on a depression in the ground, a place where something had rested, or been laid down, or had lain waiting. Surrounding this area, pressed into the softer earth, were the same prints I'd been finding around the cabin, dozens of them, as if whatever made them had been pacing, circling, approaching and retreating from the same location repeatedly. I crouched to photograph them when I noticed something else, a smell. Underneath the normal forest sense of decomposition and moisture, there was something else. Something acrid and chemical, like an animal's musk amplified, or like meat left too long in summer heat. It came and went with the shifting wind, and I realized it might have been coming from the water itself. When I looked back at Mirror Basin, the water no longer appeared still. There were ripples moving outward from the center, expanding in perfect concentric circles despite the absence of any wind on the lake's surface. I watched the ripples for what might have been a full minute, long enough for the sky to darken slightly, for the light to shift in that particular way that happens just before a storm. I hiked back to the cabin in near darkness, moving quickly enough that several times I nearly fell on roots or loose stone. When I arrived, I immediately locked every door and window. I built a fire in the stone fireplace despite the warm evening, needing the light more than the heat. My hands shook as I wrote the incident in my personal log. I didn't file an official report. Vess would have marked me as unreliable, a ranger prone to paranoia, someone who needed to be transferred. And I couldn't be transferred. Not yet, because something in me was becoming convinced that this wasn't a location-specific phenomenon, that if I left I would be taking the problem with me, and it would follow me to wherever I tried to hide next. 3 days later I encountered the lost hiker. The call came through on the radio at dawn. A distress signal relayed from a private frequency. A group of tourists had strayed from a marked trail near the southern perimeter and lost their bearings. One woman had twisted her ankle badly. They were requesting emergency assistance. I was the only ranger within realistic response distance. I packed the emergency kit, grabbed the satellite phone, and headed out on the main southern trail. The temperature had dropped overnight, and frost lingered in the shadows. The sky had that particular gray quality that precedes snow or significant weather change. I found them roughly 2 miles out, huddled in a small clearing beside a running stream. There were 4 of them, an older man, 2 women, and a young girl of maybe 9 years old. The injured woman was seated with her boot removed, her ankle badly swollen and discolored. "Thank God," the man said when he saw me. "We've been wandering for hours. The trail markers, we must have missed them." I assessed the ankle quickly. It was bad but not catastrophic, nothing immediately threatening. I had them sit down and drink water while I radioed for helicopter evacuation, knowing it would take time to coordinate. While we waited, the youngest woman, younger than the others, maybe in her 30s, pulled me aside. "There's something wrong out here," she said quietly. "This kind of thing happens," I said, expecting the usual tourist guilt and embarrassment. "People underestimate how easy it is to lose the trail." "No," she insisted. "Something else. The group saw something last night when we were trying to find our way back. Something moving between the trees, walking like..." She trailed off, searching for words. "Walking like what?" "Like a person. But wrong. Not moving right. And it was huge. I know that sounds crazy, but it was massive, and the way it moved, it was impossible. You can't walk that way. Your legs don't bend that way." I kept my expression neutral. Could have been a bear. Fear distorts perception in the dark. But I was already thinking about the prints, about the deer in the tree, about the gouges leading from the water. "The girl won't stop asking about it," the woman said. "She saw it directly, and she said it was looking at us, like it was studying us. We started running, and it followed, but not quickly. It seemed like it was just curious, just tracking us at a distance." The helicopter arrived 90 minutes later, and I helped load the injured woman and the older man aboard. The pilot would make a second trip for me and the remaining 2 women. As they lifted away, I stood in the clearing watching the trees, wondering if something had been watching from within them. That night, back in the cabin, I began researching. My internet connection was terrible, a mobile hotspot that barely functioned, but I managed to load pages that discussed sightings and folklore. I read accounts from Reddit communities dedicated to wilderness mysteries. I found stories from the Appalachian region, accounts of tall, thin figures that moved wrong, that appeared in places they shouldn't be able to reach, that seemed to operate according to rules that contradicted basic anatomy and biology. Most of the accounts mentioned an understanding that predated the sightings, indigenous knowledge, passed down in oral traditions about beings that could wear different shapes, that imitated animal movements to lure observers, that were fundamentally wrong in ways that human perception struggled to fully register. Around 3 in the morning, I found an account that matched my experience precisely. A park ranger in a different state, a different decade, describing prints that suggested an impossible gait, describing watching something drag itself from water, describing lights that seemed to move through the forest in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than animal migration. The account ended abruptly. "I'm leaving tomorrow. I can't document this officially because no one would believe it, but I can't stay. Whatever is here, it's not bound by the rules that govern normal wildlife. It's something that operates on a different understanding of what bodies can do, what shapes are possible. If you're reading this and you've seen something similar, leave. Don't try to observe it. Don't try to understand it. It's aware of you, and your attention is what it wants." I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of the cabin, listening. The prints came to the cabin again, but this time I was expecting them. I'd stayed up through the previous night, positioned near the window that faced the forest, waiting to see if what I'd observed and documented would return. It came around 2 in the morning. A sound so subtle that only careful attention made it perceptible. A sound that might have been wind moving through the pines, or might have been breathing. The prints appeared in the mud beneath the western windows, but this time there was something else. Scratches on the window glass itself. Long, deep gouges that suggested fingernails or claws of immense strength, yet they didn't break the glass. Instead, they marked it, deliberately, as if something were drawing lines across the pane. I didn't move. I didn't turn on lights or make noise. I sat absolutely still and listened to the sound of something breathing on the other side of the wall. When dawn finally came, the scratches were clear in the morning light. They formed a pattern that was almost linguistic, deliberate marks arranged to create meaning. They weren't random animal behavior, they were communication, marking territory or offering a message. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to breathe steadily, tried to think about what the scratches meant, what they were intended to convey. The knock came that afternoon, a solid, purposeful sound on the cabin door. I opened it to find Vess standing on the porch, holding a folder of reports. "Got concerned when you didn't file anything for 2 days," he said. His eyes were hard, evaluating. "Also got a call from the emergency services coordinator about your involvement with that rescue. The civilians mentioned you seemed anxious, unrealistic about timeline estimates. One woman said you looked terrified." "I'm fine," I said. "You don't look fine," Vess said. He pushed past me into the cabin and stood examining the interior. His gaze lingered on the fireplace where I'd burned several pages of my personal notes. "You been having problems out here?" I should have told him. I should have shown him the prints, the scratches, the photographs, everything. I should have made someone else responsible for what I'd discovered. But some part of me understood that Vess wouldn't believe, that he'd think I was experiencing some kind of psychological break, that the system's response would be to remove me, relocate me, treat this as a personal problem rather than a problem with the place itself. "Just adjustment difficulties," I said. "Isolation. I'm managing." Vess studied me for a moment longer. "There's been some activity reported on the western boundary, hunters claiming to have seen something unusual, not wildlife. Something that followed them, kept pace with their movements. They cut their trip short. I need you to investigate the boundary area and file comprehensive reports." "What kind of activity?" I asked, though I already knew. "The kind that doesn't exist according to conventional wildlife biology," Vess said, "but probably exists regardless. The kind of thing that suggests someone needs to either stop being a coward or stop being a ranger. Your choice which." He left 20 minutes later, but not before walking the perimeter of the cabin and examining the scratches on the window. He didn't mention them. When I asked what he thought, he said vandalism, probably bored teenagers from the valley towns, chain up the gate at the access road. That should stop it. But he was lying, or being deliberately obtuse. We both understood that teenagers couldn't create those marks, couldn't operate at those heights, couldn't match the pattern of the prints that circled the property. I drove out to the western boundary the next morning, determined to conclude something, to either document concrete evidence or admit to myself that the entire situation was a product of prolonged isolation and psychological deterioration. The western section of the forest was even more remote than my station, accessible only by rough roads that deteriorated to little more than game trails. The hunter's campsite was easy to locate. They'd left hastily, tents still standing, equipment scattered. I documented everything, photographing the layout, the trail patterns leading into and away from the site. The story the prints told was clear. Something had approached the camp repeatedly over 2 days. It had moved in circles around the tents. It had positioned itself above the camp on a slight rise, remaining stationary for long periods. Then on the second night, they'd abandoned the camp. But there was something else. In the soft earth near the tents, I found a print that was nearly human. It was large, the span nearly 14 inches from heel to toe, but the structure was bipedal. There were 5 toes, clear and distinct, arranged exactly as human toes would arrange. The pressure patterns suggested a being that walked upright, that distributed weight in a human manner, except the stride length was too great. A human covering that distance between footfalls would be nearly 8 feet tall. I photographed everything, and then sat back on my heels, suddenly exhausted. It struck me then that I'd been operating with a fundamental misunderstanding. I'd been trying to identify what I was facing by comparing it to known categories: bear, predator, wildlife. But what if the categorization was wrong? What if the thing I was tracking was operating according to rules that didn't fit into standard biological frameworks? That's when I heard the sound. It came from the forest beyond the camp, a sound that was almost like breathing but also like wind moving through a narrow opening. A bellows-like quality that suggested something of immense size drawing air through apertures my mind couldn't quite construct. I stayed very still. The sound continued for nearly a minute, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of something I'd been subconsciously noticing all morning. The complete absence of normal forest sounds. No birds, no insects, even the wind had stopped. The forest had achieved a kind of acoustic dead space. Something moved at the tree line roughly 60 yards away. It was only visible for a fraction of a second, a vertical shadow that shouldn't have cast in the current light. But the impression it left was of something tall and attenuated, something that didn't quite conform to normal spatial relationships. I packed my equipment and drove back to the cabin in full daylight. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was operating on instinct and adrenaline and the kind of fear that strips away social convention and leaves only survival logic. That night, I made a decision. Instead of running, instead of trying to arrange a transfer or admit that something was wrong, I would attempt direct observation. I would spend the night on the observation deck at Mirror Basin, equipped with recording equipment, positioned to document whatever came out of the water. The hike there took place at dusk. I was carrying more weight than usual. A sleeping bag, heavy clothing, thermos of coffee, flashlight, and a camera on a tripod with a time-lapse function. I told myself this was research. I told myself that documentation would prove something, would make whatever was happening real in a way that could be shared, explained, justified. The truth was that I was trying to force an encounter. I was trying to stop being haunted and start being aware. I positioned the camera on the observation deck, oriented toward the water, set for 20-second intervals. I settled into the sleeping bag and waited for darkness to complete. The night was cold, clear, the stars visible through the gaps in the canopy. The water of Mirror Basin was perfectly still, reflecting stars that seemed to emphasize the emptiness of the sky. Nothing happened for hours. I dozed in the sleeping bag, woke, drank coffee, dozed again. Around midnight, the temperature dropped enough that my breath began to mist. The camera continued its regular clicking pattern, recording intervals of static darkness and water. Then the water changed. Not dramatically, there was no sudden disturbance or breach, but gradually the reflected stars began to waver, to move out of focus. The surface of the lake developed a slight turbidity, as if sediment from the bottom was being stirred up. The camera clicked. The water continued to change. A shape rose from the center of the lake. It emerged slowly, and I understood with a kind of gut-level recognition that what I was watching was something acclimating itself to air, to the different physics of atmosphere versus water. It was immense, easily 15 feet in height, but the proportions were all wrong. Too many angles, too many points where the structure seemed to bend in directions that implied a skeletal system with too many joints. It raised what might have been arms, water streaming down the sides of a form that reminded me of something wearing another thing's shape. Not a body, but an approximation of a body, rendered in water and biomass and something else I couldn't quite process. The camera clicked. The thing in the lake seemed to notice the flash, because it turned directly toward the observation deck. I could see eyes now, or what served the function of eyes, dark points of focus that suggested attention and intelligence, and the kind of hunger that comes from watching something and recognizing it as material. I don't remember climbing down from the deck. I remember running, the forest exploding around me with noise and movement, branches catching at my clothing and face. I remember the beam of my flashlight illuminating nothing useful, trees and darkness, and the sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth behind me. Not moving fast, but moving with terrible certainty, following the same trail I was taking and knowing exactly where I was going. I reached the cabin at some point in that darkness. I locked the door and every window and sat in the center of the floor with lights on in every room, shaking hard enough that it was difficult to breathe steadily. The thing came to the cabin that night. It didn't try to break down the door. Instead, it circled the structure repeatedly, and I could hear it examining the walls, the windows, running something across the surfaces like fingers tracing a map. The scratches returned to the western windows, deeper this time, cutting through the glass itself without breaking it, as if force and intention were being applied with absolute precision. When dawn came, the scratching stopped. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside. The marks on the window were intricate now, forming lines and angles that suggested language or mathematical notation. I didn't try to decode them. Understanding seemed dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. Instead, I packed a single bag with essential documents and drove to the ranger station. Vess was there. He seemed to be there always now, as if he'd been waiting for me to reach this point. "I'm requesting immediate transfer," I said. "That won't help," Vess replied. He was sitting at the desk, examining the time-lapse footage from Mirror Basin on my camera. The images showed the creature's emergence with perfect clarity, every horrifying detail rendered in digital precision. "What won't help?" I asked. "Leaving, moving, running. It's not constrained to geography the way we understand geography. It's aware of you now. That awareness doesn't end because you change your location." "What is it?" I asked. "Something that's been here longer than the park, longer than the nation. It watches the boundaries between spaces, between forest and water, between civilization and wilderness, between what we understand as possible and what actually exists. The rangers who accept the job here aren't here to protect visitors. We're here to keep it contained, To ensure it doesn't venture too far into populated areas. Why didn't you tell me? Because knowing doesn't change anything except your capacity to continue functioning. Better to observe and document than to understand and despair. I left the station without another word. I drove south toward better cell service and the possibility of calling people who might help, but somewhere along the route I realized that help was predicated on being believed, and belief required that the thing be explicable. It wasn't. It existed according to rules I didn't understand, in spaces where normal physics didn't fully apply, and it had marked me as aware, which meant it would mark others through me. So I stopped driving south. Instead, I drove back toward the Appalachian forest. I submitted my resignation by email and informed Vess that I would be staying on my final week to ensure proper closure of duties. During that week, I hiked every trail, visited every observation point, mapped every location where the prints appeared. The thing that has been watching me all this time, the creature that emerged from Mirror Basin. It's not gone. I can sense it at the boundaries of spaces, watching from where the water meets the shore, observing from the dark between trees. It's made a kind of choice about me. I'm not food, though that word might mean something different to it. I'm something closer to a liaison, a consciousness that can exist in both the world of human understanding and the world that operates under different rules. I understand now why people stay in places like this, why the job exists, why Vess remains so calm in the face of the impossible. We're not protecting the world from what lives in the wilderness. We're protecting the wilderness from the world, and ourselves from the knowledge of what we're actually protecting. My final week is ending tomorrow. I don't know yet if I'm leaving or staying. Part of me wants to believe I have a choice. Part of me understands that the decision was made the moment I saw those first prints, the moment I looked directly at what was in Mirror Basin. The scratches on the window have become more detailed. If I'm right about what they represent, they're an invitation. An offer of something that exists beyond the normal categories of animal and human, survival and ending. I'll decide tomorrow. For tonight, I'm sitting on the porch, listening to the forest and waiting. My name is Kestrel, and I accepted the position as backcountry ranger at Glacier National Park for reasons that seemed sound at the time. The truth is simpler and darker than any resume could capture. I was running from something, and when the National Park Service offered me a remote winter posting in Montana, I accepted without asking difficult questions. I had worked in park administration for 11 years before that. Desk jobs, visitor centers, the slow death of fluorescent-lit cubicles. But 3 years ago, my life fractured. A search and rescue operation in Olympic National Park where I made a mistake. A hiker was never found. There was an investigation that cleared me officially but not personally. I knew what I had missed, what signs I ignored because I was tired, because I thought I knew better than the evidence in front of me. The offer came in September. Backcountry ranger for the winter season in the Glacier Basin sector, a remote area accessible only by helicopter and foot. The cabin sat at 7,200 feet, 8 miles from the nearest maintained trail, surrounded by alpine forest and glacial lakes. I would be monitoring trails, checking equipment, maintaining communication logs. Mostly I would be alone. The position felt like penance. I arrived on October 15th, when the first serious snow was falling. The helicopter dropped me with supplies, canned goods, fuel oil, propane, firewood, medical supplies, and a satellite radio that crackled occasionally with weather updates from the valley. The cabin was small, a 1970s structure with a sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a generator that groaned to life reluctantly. Through the window, I could see Piegan Lake, its surface already beginning to freeze at the edges, the water turning from blue-gray to something closer to steel. The forest surrounded everything. Stands of whitebark pine and subalpine fir pressed against the clearing, their branches already heavy with early snow. I had reviewed maps and files for weeks, but standing there, watching my breath fog in the cold cabin, I understood that maps don't convey isolation. They don't show you the weight of that silence. That first night, I unpacked slowly. My job was straightforward: maintain equipment, monitor the 2 lakes in the sector, check on the emergency shelters, document wildlife activity, and submit weekly reports via satellite. The Park Service conducted monthly welfare checks by helicopter, but otherwise the basin was mine alone for 6 months. I made coffee on the camp stove and opened the previous ranger's logbook. His name was Marcus. He had held the position for 2 winters. The entries were brief, professional, dated daily, October through April. I skimmed through his notes, weather observations, equipment maintenance, routine. Then I found an entry from March of his 2nd winter. The handwriting looked the same, but the content changed. Heard something in the timber. Deep sound, almost like calling. Animal? Never heard it before in the park. Came from northeast sector, toward the old camp. Can't identify. Will document further if pattern continues. The next entry was 5 days later. Sound again. Different location, closer to the lake. More distinct now. Pattern suggests intelligent movement. Not tracking correctly. Reviewed mammal calls, not matching any known species. Documented at 0300 and 0430. Woke to it 3 days after that. Impossible. The patterns make no sense. The creature or thing is moving faster than any animal should. I've hiked these areas for 2 seasons. I know the wildlife. This is not something I can identify. The calling is starting to get inside my head. That sounds absurd. I'll stop mentioning it unless something concrete occurs. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later, and it simply said, transferred out effective immediately. Family emergency. Replacement arriving within 3 weeks. I sat with the logbook for a long time. Marcus hadn't finished his second winter. There was no documentation of any family emergency in the official transfer records I had reviewed. I checked the dates. He had lasted exactly 16 months in the basin. The last month of entries were sparse, and the final handwritten note was barely legible. I told myself that rangers quit. Remote positions were difficult. Isolation affected people differently. Some couldn't handle the silence, the solitude, the complete absence of human contact. It was normal, common even, but I kept that logbook close through the night, and I found myself listening to the forest beyond the cabin walls. The first week was ordinary. I established my routine, hiked the northern trails, documented the equipment status, and made my first report. The weather turned colder. Fresh snow fell most days. The lakes froze solid enough to walk on by late October. I saw deer, a mule deer that watched me from the timber edge before disappearing. I found fresh bear scat, though the bears should have been denning by then. I documented it anyway, noting the location and fresh tracks. On October 24th, at approximately 0200 hours, I heard something that made me sit up in my sleeping bag. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like a vibration in the air. Something pitched too low to recognize as a distinct call, but present enough that my body responded before my mind did. Every nerve went tight. I reached for the flashlight and the bear spray, even knowing that neither would help if something had gotten inside the cabin. The sound didn't repeat. I stayed awake until dawn, listening. Nothing else came. When the light returned, I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was secured. No prints in the snow around the cabin. No signs of disturbance. I made coffee and told myself it was the wind. Mountain passes create strange acoustics. Sound moves oddly in cold air. But I remembered Marcus's logbook sitting on the shelf, and his words about sounds that got inside your head. November brought deeper cold and a sense that the basin was transforming into something less forgiving. The daylight shrank to perhaps 7 hours. Most of my time was spent in the cabin, maintaining equipment, reading, or simply watching the forest through the window. The wildlife activity became notably wrong. On November 3rd, I found a partially eaten moose calf near the eastern perimeter. The kill was fresh, probably within 24 hours. But the consumption pattern was unusual. The animal had been opened, the organs removed first, in a precise manner, and then the kills abandoned. The carcass had barely been touched for food. I had documented dozens of predator kills in my career. This bore no resemblance to anything I recognized. No predator in the North American wilderness kills like that. No animal tears an opening with that kind of surgical precision and then leaves the meat to rot. I documented photos, measurements, and detailed notes. I filed it in my weekly report under Unusual Wildlife Behavior. The response from headquarters was a brief message asking me to document any similar incidents and recommending I increase my perimeter patrols to establish what might be in the sector. What might be in the sector? As if we both knew something was wrong, but the official language had to remain neutral. On November 12th, I was hiking the southern ridge, checking the emergency shelter maintained there, when I found something that changed everything. Near the shelter, half buried in fresh snow, was clothing. Not recent clothing, this was old, fabric deteriorated, partially consumed by weather and presumably animals over years. I uncovered enough to find a name stitched into a jacket. Rivera Park Service. I didn't remember any missing Park Service personnel, but the jacket was old enough that it might predate my tenure or even my career. I collected samples, photographed everything, and expanded my search of the surrounding area. The shelter itself showed no signs of disturbance. Nothing indicated that whoever wore that jacket had died there recently, but someone had worn it. Someone had been in the basin. Someone had presumably never left. I cross-referenced the name in my files. There was no Rivera in the personnel records I had access to. I sent an encrypted message to headquarters asking them to research the name. The response came back 48 hours later. No record of Rivera in our system. Possibly equipment error or misidentification. Continue monitoring. But I had the jacket. The jacket was real. Someone named Rivera had stood in that place and worn that coat. And now only the deteriorating fabric remained, buried under years of snow and time. Something was wrong with the official response, or something was being omitted. The second week of November brought the first direct encounter with something I couldn't rationalize. I was in the cabin around 0400, unable to sleep. The moon was full and bright enough to illuminate the landscape like weak daylight. The snow glowed. I sat at the window, watching the lake, when movement caught my attention. Something was walking across the frozen surface. At first I thought it was a moose. The shape suggested something large, four-legged bipedal in its movement. But as it came closer to the cabin, the proportions became increasingly wrong. The legs were too long, the stride too fluid. The posture seemed to shift between genuine four-limbed locomotion and something that occasionally rose onto its hind legs before dropping back down. I grabbed the binoculars. The moon was too dim for clear focus, but I could make out enough to know that what I was seeing was not any identified wildlife. The body appeared to be covered in what might have been hide or fur, but the coloration was odd, darker than any North American mammal, with a texture that seemed to shimmer despite the cold and the moonlight. As I watched, the creature stopped. On the lake, less than 300 yards from the cabin, it became still. Even with binoculars, I couldn't quite make out the head region. It was as if that area resisted focus, as if my eyes couldn't quite process what was there. Then it moved its head. I heard the sound. It was the sound I had heard that first night. That deep, resonant vibration. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. A call, a sound that no human throat should be able to produce. The frequency was too low, the duration too long. It started at the threshold of hearing and descended into ranges that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. I stumbled backward from the window, knocking over the chair. I reached for the radio, but I didn't know what to report. What could I say? That something large and unidentified was on the lake making impossible sounds. When I looked back through the window, the creature was gone. The ice was empty, the snow undisturbed except for what appeared to be tracks. But the tracks didn't form any coherent pattern. They started and stopped at random locations as if the animal had simply disappeared. I didn't sleep. I made coffee, maintained the fire, and waited for dawn. When the light came, I went down to the lake with a rifle and examined the ice carefully. The tracks were there, deep, three-toed impressions that suggested something heavy and clawed. But they really did appear to stop in the middle of the frozen surface, with no corresponding trail leading away. In my logbook I wrote, November 15th, 0415. Observed large unidentified animal on Piegan Lake, approximately 300–400 pounds estimated. Vocalizations recorded. Tracks suggest unknown species. Physical characteristics inconsistent with documented regional wildlife. Recommend investigation. But I didn't file it in the official report. I kept it separate, in a personal journal. Because I already knew what the response would be. Not found. Document further. No action required. Something in the basin knew I was here now, and I suspected it had been aware of my presence much longer than I had been aware of its. On November 28th, the radio crackled at 280 with a message that broke the terrible routine. A hiker was overdue from a backcountry camp. She had reported her position on a personal locator beacon at the edge of my sector. This was the first time in 6 weeks that another human voice had come through the radio network, and it felt like a shattering of some fragile equilibrium I had established. Her name was Adrienne. She had been hiking with a group that split up. She was supposed to loop back to the main camp by November 27th. The group waited until evening before initiating the emergency protocol. A helicopter would reach my location by afternoon to establish a search perimeter. I prepared immediately. I packed emergency supplies, warm clothing, medical kit, and the rifle. The beacon signal placed her approximately 4 miles northeast near the old surveying camp that still appeared on some maps but was rarely visited. The helicopter arrived at 1400 hours. 2 National Guard personnel and an official from Search and Rescue. We reviewed the beacon coordinates and the last known position of the hiking group. The weather had turned relatively clear, but temperatures were dropping rapidly, and night would fall in less than 6 hours. "We'll establish a visual sweep first," the SAR coordinator, whose name was Hendricks, said. "If we spot her, we radio a pickup point. If not, we establish a search grid." We flew toward the coordinates. The basin spread below us, the landscape I had come to know on foot suddenly alien from the air. The trees were a dark blanket. The lakes were silver and gray. The old camp appeared as a small cluster of structures barely visible among the timber. We didn't see Adrienne. Hendricks made the decision to land the helicopter near the camp and conduct a foot search while there was still light. I was brought along as part of the response team. We touched down on a small clearing near the camp's remains. The buildings were in partial decay, equipment scattered and rusted. This place had been abandoned for decades. The beacon signal placed Adrienne approximately half a mile northeast, deeper into the timber. We moved into the forest carefully. The temperature had dropped further, and I could see my breath frosting on my face. The SAR team was experienced, moving with practiced efficiency, but there was a tension in their movements. Even trained search and rescue personnel understand that backcountry rescues in late November are often recovery operations. We found her clothing first. The jacket was spread across a deadfall tree, arranged rather than scattered. Beside it, her pack, opened. The contents were scattered in what looked like an organized fashion. Her sleeping bag, her food supplies, emergency flares, all arranged in a pattern that made no sense for accidental dispersal. "She's close," Hendricks said, but his voice carried doubt. She wouldn't have removed her jacket willingly. We expanded our search radius. I was moving through the underbrush when I noticed something disturbing the snow about 40 feet ahead. My stomach constricted. I moved toward it slowly. It was a hand. Female. The skin was already darkening from cold exposure. The arm extended from beneath a pile of pine branches that had been arranged deliberately over the body. "Here," I called out. I kept my voice level, professional, though something in my chest was fracturing. "She's here." The SAR team moved quickly. They cleared the branches away from the body. Adrienne was lying on her side, her face turned away, her remaining clothing in disorder. But it was the condition of her exposed skin that made even Hendricks pause. The flesh was marked with deep striations, as if something with significant claw structure had raked across her back and arms repeatedly. The wounds suggested defensive injuries, but the damage was far beyond what any bear attack would inflict. No wild animal tears at prey with this kind of methodical precision. "This isn't right," one of the SAR team members, a woman named Reeves, said quietly. "This isn't anything I've seen." The helicopter pilot called on the radio asking for status. Hendricks made the call to evacuate the body and return to base. This was now a criminal investigation, an entirely different protocol. As we were preparing the body for transport, I found myself looking back into the forest, toward the deeper darkness beneath the massive firs. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that Adrienne had not died here by accident. She had been killed, and she had been left arranged, displayed like a message. The helicopter came back as darkness was falling completely. Adrienne was loaded carefully into a body bag. The SR team took extensive photos and measurements. They called for state police and forensics teams to arrive in the morning. As we lifted away, I looked down at the old camp, at the spot where we had found her. And I thought about Marcus's logbook, about Rivera's jacket, about how the basin had been hungry for a long time, and how it had finally gotten what it wanted. The investigation consumed the next week. State police established a temporary camp near the basin. Helicopters came and went daily. They conducted interviews with me, reviewing my logs, my observations, my documentation of the unusual animal remains and scat. The official determination came on December 5th. Cause of death, exposure and trauma consistent with large animal predation. Manner of death, accident. Contributing factors, hiking alone, inadequate equipment, poor weather decisions, but the claw marks were too defined. The arrangement of the body too deliberate. The pattern of the injury too precise. One detective, a woman named Garrett, seemed to understand my concerns. After the official briefing, she pulled me aside. "You've been up here 6 weeks, she said. "You're the closest thing we have to a permanent observer. Off the record, what do you think happened to her?" I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to stay within the official narrative. But I thought about Marcus, about the logbook, about the creature on the frozen lake. "I don't think a bear killed her," I said. "I don't think any known animal killed her." Garrett nodded slowly. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that, but I had to ask." She showed me something then, a folder with historical documents. Missing person reports from Glacier National Park, dating back to the 1970s. 12 cases, 12 hikers, backcountry workers, rangers, who had gone missing in the Glacier Basin sector specifically. Only 3 bodies had ever been recovered. All showed unusual trauma patterns. All had been ruled as animal-related or accidental. What we know is that something is actively hunting in this sector, Garrett said. What we don't know is what it is. There are old references, I said carefully. Historical accounts, frontier journals, local Blackfeet histories mention something in the high territories. Something that hunts, that hungers. The Wendigo, Garrett said. It wasn't a question. I had never spoken the name aloud in an official capacity. It felt like giving it power, like acknowledging that the folklore, the old stories, the whispered accounts from previous centuries were something more than mythology. The evidence suggests predatory behavior, Garrett continued. Hunting patterns, territory markers, communication through vocalization. It doesn't match any documented North American predator because it's not a documented species. Or, she paused, it's not a species that science has been willing to acknowledge. What will the Park Service do? I asked. Nothing that helps you, she said bluntly. We can't release information about a creature we can't prove exists. The park would lose revenue, lawsuits would follow. What we will do is quietly upgrade safety protocols, increase ranger presence in high-risk areas, and advise that the basin be closed to backcountry hiking after October. It was something, but it was inadequate. The thing in the basin didn't care about official protocols or seasonal closures. After the investigation officially concluded, the police helicopters left. The basin returned to silence. They offered me evacuation, an end to my contract, a quiet exit from the position. I refused. Partly out of stubbornness, partly because I understood, finally, why I had accepted this job. I wasn't just seeking penance for the missed hiker in Olympic National Park. I was being called to witness something, to document it, to understand it. I went back to the basin with a different frame of mind. I began reading everything I could about Wendigo accounts, historical documents, indigenous oral traditions, frontier journals. The pattern was consistent across centuries and across vast geographic distances. The creature was solitary. It was intelligent. It hunted with purpose and patience. It communicated through sounds that existed at the edge of human perception. It never left areas once it had established territory, and it was hungry. Always, fundamentally, irreducibly hungry. I discovered in Marcus's personal effects, left in the cabin, a handwritten note that had never made it to official reports. It's not an animal, I'm certain now. It's something that was here before us, that has been here much longer than the park existed. It understands the land completely. It knows every trail, every shelter, every place a human might hide. The hunger it carries is not like animal hunger. It's something absolute, something that shapes its entire existence. I can feel it sometimes when the wind comes from the northeast. I can feel the weight of its attention. I'm leaving because I can't stay, because if I stay, I think it will take that as an invitation. I think it will stop hunting randomly and start hunting deliberately. I think it will come for me. He had written this in March. He had left by June. He had run. I made the decision then to stay, but differently. Not to run, not to hide, to document, to understand, to be a witness to something that humanity preferred not to acknowledge. The winter deepened. Temperatures dropped to -20 Fahrenheit on most nights. Snow accumulated to depths where hiking became nearly impossible. I maintained my position, my routines, my observations. The weekly reports I filed with the Park Service became increasingly vague. I learned that official bureaucracy preferred gaps in information to uncomfortable truths. On January 13th, approximately 6 weeks after Adrian's death, I received a message on the satellite radio. A helicopter was coming for a mandatory welfare check. It wasn't scheduled for another month, but the Park Service had decided my mental state warranted early verification. I knew they were coming to extract me, to remove the witness who had too much information. I spent that day preparing the cabin. I compiled everything into detailed files. My logs, my observations, photographs, documented incidents, Marcus's notes, everything. I prepared it as though I was writing testimony that would outlast me. I sealed it in waterproof cases. The helicopter arrived at 1400 hours. 2 officials from district office and a helicopter pilot. I was informed that my contract would be terminated effective immediately. Mental stress, isolation concerns, recommendation for extended leave. I had prepared for this too. I had written documentation of everything I had observed, everything I understood. I had prepared it as a formal report, complete with evidence and references. I handed it to the senior official. "I'm not leaving," I said. "Not voluntarily." The official looked at the documentation. His face didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "Sir, you're relieved of duty. This is not a negotiation. Then I'm filing this as a formal account of unusual activity in the basin. It will become public record. That documentation will survive, regardless of where I am." They looked at each other. They had expected compliance. They hadn't expected resistance with documentation. In the end, they left without me. I had called their bluff. My physical removal would generate questions, investigations, exactly what the Park Service wanted to avoid. They departed with my reports and my statements, and they left me alone in the basin with the thing that lived there. That was 48 days ago. The things I have documented in that time, I barely have language for. On January 27th, I saw it clearly for the first time. Not on the lake, but closer. It came to the edge of the clearing during daylight, testing the boundary between the forest and my territory. It was massive, perhaps 8 feet tall when it rose on its hind legs, though it primarily moved on 4 limbs with a fluid, unsettling grace. The coloration was darker than wood, darker than bark, something close to the color of exposed earth or old blood. But the eyes. Even at distance, I could see the eyes. They were not animal eyes. They held intelligence, but an intelligence fundamentally alien to human comprehension. They held hunger of a kind that transcended simple predatory need. It watched me watching it for approximately 30 seconds. Then it turned and moved back into the timber, and the forest seemed to absorb it completely. On February 3rd, it killed a bighorn sheep and left it in the clearing 200 yards from the cabin. The kill was fresh, made in daylight, made where I could witness it. The arrangement was deliberate. An offering, a message. On February 11th, I found scratch marks on the cabin walls. Deep, systematic claw marks that could not have been made by any animal passing by. These were made by something that had stood upright against the wooden structure, driven by something resembling purpose or intention. The creature is testing my resolve. It is aware that I have not left. It is curious about a human who does not flee. I understand now what Marcus could not articulate. The hunger it carries is not solved by meat. It hunts humans specifically because human fear, human desperation, human struggle feeds something deeper than biological need. It hunts because we run, because we fight, because we comprehend our own predation in ways that give the hunt meaning. I will not run. I will not hide. The Park Service expects me to have broken by now. They expect my next communication to be a request for extraction. But I am transmitting my final account to ensure that if I do not survive the winter, this testimony remains. The basin is not empty. The ancient hunger that the Blackfeet knew about, that the frontier trappers whispered about in camps, that has taken people for centuries, is still there. It is patient, it is intelligent, it is not going anywhere. On February 19th, I saw it approach the cabin after dark. I opened the door and stood in the doorway, every instinct screaming to close myself away. The creature stopped at the edge of the light thrown by the lamp from inside. We regarded each other. "I will not run," I said aloud. The words felt absurd, but I spoke them anyway. "I will not flee. I will witness and document and survive, and your hunger will not consume me." The creature made that sound, the deep vibration, the tone that exists at the edge of what human ears can process. But this time I heard something in it that might have been recognition, not acceptance, recognition. Then it turned away and disappeared into the forest. I do not know what will happen when spring arrives. I do not know if the Park Service will attempt to retrieve me by force, or if they will simply abandon this sector to whatever inhabits it. I do not know if the creature in the basin will eventually lose patience with my presence, or if its interest will continue indefinitely. What I know is that I have accepted the hunger. I have acknowledged its existence in this place. I will not flee like Marcus. I will not deny like the bureaucrats who filed Adrienne's death as a simple accident. I am the witness now. I am the one who speaks what cannot be officially acknowledged. And until my transmission ends, everyone listening will know that something ancient moves through the high places of this world. Something that was here long before we arrived. Something that will persist long after we are gone. The basin holds many secrets. It holds the dust of those who came seeking solitude and found only silence. It holds the knowledge that humanity's dominion over wilderness is a polite fiction, a story we tell ourselves in lit rooms and concrete cities. The winter continues. The snow falls. The creature waits, and I remain. I came to Glacier National Park for the same reason most people run into wilderness. I needed to disappear. My name is Dakota. I'm 34 years old, and I worked for 12 years in Denver as a wildlife biologist. That's the clean version of the story. The real version is messier. My wife Marcella left me in February. She took our daughter with her. I watched their car pull away from our house on a Tuesday morning in cold rain, and I remember thinking the weather felt appropriate for loss. By March, my lab supervisor had caught me making errors in data entry, careless, stupid mistakes that could have compromised a 5-year study. He suggested I take medical leave. I suggested I never come back. A week of unemployment became 2. I spent those weeks staring at apartment walls, cycling through the same 3 thoughts: failure, abandonment, and a curious numbness that scared me more than grief would have. I was 20 pounds underweight, and my sister finally stopped calling after I didn't answer for a month. The position opened in May, ranger post at Glacier, stationed at the remote north sector. The Park Service needed someone immediately. A transfer had fallen through. Most of the experienced rangers wanted the more prestigious assignments: popular campgrounds, visitor centers, trails that actually saw human traffic. The north sector was different. It was 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by trail or helicopter during winter. A cabin, a lake, responsibility for roughly 48,000 acres of forest that very few people ever entered. I applied on a Wednesday. They called me Friday. I drove north Monday morning. The helicopter dropped me at the cabin on a clear afternoon in late May. The pilot shouted something I couldn't hear over the rotors, pointing at the supply containers. I waved to acknowledge I understood, and he lifted off without waiting for confirmation. I watched the aircraft shrink against blue sky, disappearing toward the visitor center near St. Mary Lake, leaving me alone with 2 months of food, emergency communications equipment, and the kind of silence I'd never experienced in my life. The cabin was smaller than I expected, roughly 12 by 16 feet, with a wood stove, cot, desk, and minimal kitchen setup. The walls were logs, dark and aged, with the kind of gaps that suggested winter winds would find their way inside no matter how carefully you sealed them. A ranger had scratched his name into a support beam. Marcus, 1987. Another, I was here, 2003. Small acts of defiance against the silence. Outside, the land opened in every direction. Glacier sprawls across nearly 1 million acres of wilderness, and most of those acres feel untouched. The forest here was primarily lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, with creek-fed meadows of lupine and glacier lily pushing toward the light. Hidden Lake lay half a mile northwest, fed by a glacier that was retreating year by year. The park rangers called these remote posts the real glacier, the places tourists never reached, where elk herds moved through ancient valleys and wolverines hunted in ranges that hadn't changed in centuries. I was supposed to monitor wildlife populations, maintain trails, handle search and rescue if anyone got lost in the sector, and file weekly reports using the SATCOM unit. The job required me to leave the cabin maybe twice a week to do my rounds. The rest of the time was mine. That first evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the shadows lengthen across the meadow. The air smelled like pine resin and soil, and something else, something clean and old and vast. For the first time in years, I felt the tightness in my chest ease. No emails. No fluorescent lights, no photographs of my daughter on my ex-wife's social media growing up without me present, just forest and silence and the work of staying alive in a place that demanded attention. I had no idea that attention would become survival. The first sign was the elk. I found it 3 days later on my initial circuit of the sector. A bull, 5 or 6 years old, lying dead in a clearing about a mile from the cabin. The carcass was fresh, maybe 12 hours old. I knelt beside it, running through the possibilities. Predation from wolves or bears was my first thought, but the wounds were wrong. The animal hadn't been eviscerated or dragged. Its left hind leg was broken. The bone snapped clean above the hock. The injuries looked like something had struck it repeatedly, with purpose. The tracks around the body were confusing. I've been trained in wildlife tracking since graduate school. I can read the story a landscape tells. The tracks here told no coherent story. They moved in wrong patterns. They appeared and disappeared without logic. In places there were marks that looked almost like hoofprints, but the spacing was off, the depth inconsistent. And then there were handprints. Actually handprints, human handprints made deep in the soft earth beside the carcass, pressed down with force, fingers splayed. I photographed everything and made notes. The SATCOM wasn't for casual communication, but this was standard reporting predator activity in the sector. The dispatcher confirmed receipt and asked if the body showed signs of disease. I said no. He said to monitor the area and report if I found more. I told him I would. That night I couldn't sleep. The cabin had good locks, but I kept thinking about those handprints. About a human walking through these woods, attacking an elk with something, leaving impressions that seemed almost too deliberate to be accidental. I wondered if there was a poacher in the sector. It happens sometimes, someone with a blind spot about what wilderness meant, thinking they could take what they wanted from a place that belonged to everyone. I resolved to hike north the next day toward the higher elevations. If someone was actively hunting in this area, they'd likely be working the ridges where game was concentrated. What I found instead was worse. The second body was a mountain goat, about 2 miles from the elk. This one was older, maybe a week dead, though the high elevation kept decomposition slow. It was positioned oddly, draped across a flat rock in a way nothing falls naturally. The hind legs hung off the edge. The head pointed upward. The injuries were similar to the elk. Blunt force trauma, broken bones, no actual predator feeding pattern. And again, those handprints. Dozens of them circling the carcass. Large hands. Too large. I photographed this one too, but I didn't report it through SATCOM. I told myself it was because I needed more data points, more evidence of a pattern before I made an official report that might bring investigators or extra rangers into my territory. But truthfully, I was beginning to feel afraid in a way that didn't have a rational explanation. Those handprints bothered me. The positioning of the animals bothered me. The sense of something moving through the forest with intention bothered me. That night I made a mistake that would shape everything that followed. I searched my temporary ranger files for any reports from previous seasons about unusual activity. There wasn't much, mostly notes about avalanche danger, water conditions, and standard wildlife observations. But buried in a 2011 report I found a footnote, a paragraph written by a ranger named Briggs, dated September. Unusual herd behavior observed on the northeast slope. Elk showing signs of extreme agitation and stress. Possible predator activity, though no kills were found. Local native guides consulted per protocol, no confirmation of unusual activity, but guides declined to enter the area after sunset. Possible cultural sensitivity regarding region. Investigation closed, no evidence of direct threat to ranger safety. Standard protocols maintained. The note was vague. I wanted more information. I radioed into the main station and asked if there were any ongoing wildlife or safety concerns in the north sector that I should be aware of. The ranger who answered, a woman named Josephine, paused for longer than seemed necessary. Nothing current, she said finally. You'll be fine out there, just keep your radio on. The way she said it didn't match her words. 4 days into my posting, I saw the deer. It was standing in the meadow beside Hidden Lake, about a 1/4 mile from my cabin. I was sitting on the porch with binoculars, doing evening observation, when I spotted it. At first I thought nothing of it. The meadow attracted deer regularly, particularly mule deer looking for water. But this one held my attention. It was motionless for an unusually long time, and through the binoculars I could see something was off about its proportions. The legs were too long, the body too lean. The head was tilted at an angle that felt wrong, as if its neck was jointed differently than it should be. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes. When I raised them again, the deer hadn't moved. It was still watching the cabin. I was certain it was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch. The meadow grass came up to my knees, and the distance to the deer felt shorter than the 1/4 mile I'd estimated. I moved slowly, trying not to startle it. As I got closer, my jaw began to tighten. The details I could see through the binoculars weren't as clear in direct observation, but they were worse. The deer's movements were jerky, almost mechanical. It would freeze in one position, then shift suddenly to another. Its head rotated with an intelligence that no prey animal displayed. I was about 100 yards from it when it turned and walked into the tree line. I never saw it move its legs. It seemed to slide backward into the shadows of the pines, its body held at an odd angle, still watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the stove hot, every light in the cabin on, and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A sick deer, an optical illusion from exhaustion, the subconscious mind playing tricks on someone who'd come to the wilderness to heal. But that notebook of observations was sitting on my desk. Briggs's cryptic note about herd behavior and local guides who wouldn't enter the forest after dark. I knew the folklore. I'd read enough about Native American cultures and the history of Glacier National Park to know that the tribes with claims to this land, the Kootenai, the Salish, the Blackfeet, had stories about things that moved through these woods, stories about skin changers, Creatures that could take the shape of animals but weren't animals. Beings that wore stolen forms like clothing, and if you looked too carefully, you'd see the seams where the disguise didn't quite fit. The Salish called them Aikia. The stories varied, but the core was the same. They hunted at night. They were drawn to humans, and they were smart enough to test you, to learn you, before they attacked. I thought about those handprints on the ground beside the dead animals. Hands that were human-shaped but wrong. Hands attached to something that wore an elk's skin or a goat's skin but moved like something else entirely. By the time sunrise came, I'd shifted from disbelief to a kind of cold acceptance. I wasn't going to report what I'd seen to Josephine or anyone else. I was going to observe. I was going to figure out what was moving through my sector. And I was going to survive it. I just didn't understand yet how little control that belief gave me. The weather changed on my 10th day at the cabin. The forecast I'd received before my supply drop had predicted clear skies through June, but clouds moved in on a Wednesday afternoon, dark and low, cutting the visibility across the meadow to maybe 300 yards. The temperature dropped. I could smell rain coming, that metallic scent that precedes a summer storm in high elevations. I was recording observations in my daily log when I heard the splashing from Hidden Lake. It was loud enough to cut through the cabin walls. Something big moving through water. I grabbed my binoculars and stepped outside. The rain was beginning, light at first, each drop cold. The lake was maybe a half-mile away through the pines, but I could see movement in the near shallows even through the rain and poor visibility. Something was in the water, something large. I hiked out to get a better view. The trail to the lake was well maintained. I'd walked it daily since arriving, but the forest felt different under the storm. The trees seemed to press closer. The sound of rain on the canopy made the world feel smaller, more contained. I kept my hand on the bear spray at my belt, though I wasn't sure why. A bear in the lake wouldn't present the kind of threat I was starting to feel pressed against the edges of my perception. When I reached the shore, the water was churning. Rain was falling harder now, creating a textured gray surface that made it difficult to see clearly. But I could make out a shape just offshore, moving in a way that suggested powerful limbs, a body built for the water. For a moment I thought bear. A grizzly could swim that way, powerful and purposeful, but the movement was wrong. The rhythm was off. It moved like something with joints that bent in too many directions. And then I heard it making sounds. Not animal sounds, not quite. The closest I can describe it is like someone trying to mimic a bird call but doing it with a human voice, a high keening sound that fluctuated between a cry and a song, repeated in patterns that seemed structured, intentional. Language, maybe. Or hunting calls. Something designed to communicate across water. The creature. I couldn't think of it as anything else now, submerged. The surface went smooth. The keening stopped. I waited. Rain running down my face, every muscle in my body rigid. Minutes passed. The storm continued. And then, 50 yards down the shoreline, something exploded from the water. For half a second I saw it clearly. Glimpses, fragmented images, wet fur that moved wrong, as if it was loose on the underlying body. A face that was nearly human but extended, stretched, with teeth that caught the storm light. Limbs that moved with an articulation that no natural creature achieved. It took 2 bounds up the shore in my direction before it seemed to notice me, and when its head snapped toward me, the sound it made was a shriek that carried rationality in it. Not an animal recognizing danger. Not a hunt response. Something conscious realizing it was being observed. I ran. I don't remember consciously deciding to run, but I was running, crashing through the underbrush back toward the cabin, and I could hear it behind me. Not close, whatever it wasn't charging directly, but parallel to me, moving through the forest with devastating speed. I heard trees breaking. I heard that sound again, that not quite bird call that seemed designed to communicate panic. I made it to the cabin and slammed the door, throwing every lock, dragging a chair in front of the bolt. Through the window I could see shapes moving in the rain, circling. More than one. I'd only seen one clearly, but there were definitely more of them out there, drawn by the sound of my presence, my fear, the vibrations of my flight. That night was the first time I truly understood I was in a hunt. Not the kind of casual predator-prey dynamics that happen in any wilderness. A hunt. Deliberate. Orchestrated. Something was testing me, learning my behavior, my vulnerabilities, my patterns. I tried the SATCOM. Josephine's voice came back immediately, as if she'd been waiting for the call. When I told her there was possible predator activity in the sector, aggressive and unusual, she went quiet for so long I thought the connection had dropped. "Stay in the cabin," she said finally. "Keep the radio on. Don't leave after dark, ever. Do you understand? What is it? I asked her. What's out there? She didn't answer. She said she'd file a report, said I should maintain standard safety protocols, and told me again to stay in the cabin after dark. Then she signed off. I spent that night listening to the movements in the forest, the keening calls that seemed to move around the cabin in patterns, the sounds of things testing the walls, checking the windows, evaluating the structure as if determining whether they could breach it. By morning, I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I saw faces in the shadows on the cabin walls. I felt certain that the creature from the lake had found a way inside and was hiding, waiting. I had to physically search every corner of the cabin 3 times before I could convince myself I was alone. The next 2 days I stayed inside except for essential tasks. I prepared food. I monitored the radio. I read through all the files again, looking for anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. And I found something buried in a 2001 report. A ranger named Williams had written a personal memo. Not official, just notes he'd kept during his posting. The memo described unusual activity in the North Sector, animal kills that didn't match predation patterns, and wildlife stress that seemed to correlate with particular times of the month. Williams had interviewed a Blackfeet elder, a man named Joseph Medicine Bird, who had traditional knowledge of the area. The memo included a quote, "The walker between shapes uses the bodies of animals to move among humans. It tests you because it is hungry, but it hunts the way a person hunts, with thought and patience. Do not let it learn you, do not show it your fear. Move different than you moved before." Williams had left the post after 3 months. His final note said he'd requested a transfer to a high-traffic area and had recommended the North Sector be closed to single ranger postings. His recommendation had been denied. I realized something while reading that memo. I was the 4th ranger in that cabin facing this thing. And I was the only one still alive who could talk about it, because Josephine clearly knew, and she was trying to keep me alive through silence and protocol. That afternoon I made a decision. I was going to hike north, to the higher elevations near the glacier sources where the creature seemed less active. I was going to move in a different pattern, break my routine, and see if I could get far enough into the backcountry to understand what I was dealing with. It was a stupid decision, but I was beginning to understand that understanding might be the only way to survive this posting. The hike north took me into territory marked on my maps as primitive wilderness. Beyond the maintained trails, beyond the areas where the Park Service had established regular routes, the elevation increased rapidly, the forest thinning as I climbed into subalpine meadows where only low shrubs and alpine flowers grew. I moved through the afternoon and into evening, deliberately not setting up camp until dark had fallen. The sky was clear, no rain threatening, and the stars were coming out with a clarity that made me dizzy. I'd never seen skies like that in Denver, air so clean that the galaxy itself seemed visible. I set up a cold camp, no fire, just my sleeping bag in a hollow between 2 boulders that would shield me from view of the forest below. I didn't sleep. I lay awake with my knife in my hand and listened. Around midnight, I heard it. That keening call, but from multiple directions, and it had changed. It was more organized. It didn't sound like hunting calls anymore, it sounded like communication, argument. The creatures were calling back and forth, their voices carrying across the high elevation, and the pattern of their exchange suggested they were discussing something, debating, maybe about me. At some point before dawn I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Actual human footsteps, the kind a person makes. I gripped my knife tighter. Through the darkness I could see a shape moving across the meadow roughly in my direction. It was roughly humanoid, moving on 2 legs, but the gait was wrong. The limbs bent at angles that suggested different anatomy. It walked across the field where rocks and outcroppings should have tripped it, moving with perfect knowledge of the terrain despite the darkness. When it got closer, I could see it was wearing something like a skin pulled too tight. A face that was almost human but not quite. Eyes that were too large and too dark. It was wearing the form of a man, but like Williams's memo had said, the seams were visible if you looked carefully. The edges of the human shape didn't quite fit the thing wearing it. It stopped about 20 feet from my position, turning its head in a way no human neck could achieve. Its teeth reflected what little moonlight existed. It was tasting the air, actually tasting my presence on the wind. I forced myself not to move, not to breathe harder, understanding in that moment that my fear had a smell it could detect. The thing made a sound then, not the keening call, but something more complex. It sounded almost like speech. Garbled and wrong, but structured. It was trying to talk to me, or trying to reproduce human language for some purpose I couldn't understand. It took a step forward, then another. I knew it was about to charge, about to test whether it could kill me or whether I had the capacity to fight. I drew myself out of my sleeping bag and stood, bringing the knife up. The creature's head tilted with curiosity, and it smiled. Actually smiled. The expression was more disturbing than the hunger would have been. And then there was a sound that made every nerve in my body go rigid. The sound of something larger moving through the meadow toward us both. Heavy footsteps. Deliberate. Something that wasn't trying to hide. The creature in human shape released a sound that was pure frustration, and it moved away from me with speed that was inhuman, flowing back toward the forest. I watched it go, my hands shaking, and then I turned toward the source of the heavy footsteps. It was a bear, a massive grizzly, maybe 10 years old, moving with the steady determination of an animal that knew this was its territory. For a horrible moment, I thought I'd escaped one predator only to face another, but the bear wasn't looking at me. It was tracking the creature that had fled into the trees. It huffed once, a sound of defiance, and then it followed. I understood in that moment something that changed everything. The bear had saved me, not because it cared about my survival, but because it had territorial claim over this meadow. The creature I'd seen was not just another predator in a landscape full of them. It was something that other predators defended against, something even bears considered a threat. I packed my gear and didn't wait for dawn. I moved down the mountain using moonlight, placing each step carefully, maintaining a speed that was fast but not panicked. Behind me I could hear the sounds of the bear and the creature fighting through the timber, crashes of bodies against trees, sounds of impact, the bear's roars and the creature's keening calls. By the time I reached the meadow near Hidden Lake, the sounds had faded. I was alone, or as alone as anyone could be in a place where something was learning your pattern, your voice, your individual scent. I was beginning to understand what the creatures wanted. They didn't want to simply kill me. They wanted to understand me, to learn me completely. And once they understood, once they'd mapped every detail of my behavior and psychology, they would be able to wear my shape and walk among humans perfectly. That was why they circled, why they called back and forth, why they tested me with that creature wearing human form, to see how I responded, what my fear looked like, what I did when confronted with the impossible. They were taking notes, gathering data on the specific human they were hunting. In the cabin that night, I made a decision that would determine everything that followed. I was going to stop being what they were hunting. I was going to break my own patterns completely. I was going to become unpredictable. For 5 days I lived in the forest, not in any planned way. I simply refused to return to the cabin. I moved through the territory in patterns I hadn't established, sleeping in different locations, changing my route every few hours, eating cold rations, drinking from streams I hadn't used before. I wanted to become a pattern that the creatures couldn't learn. It worked, partially. The keening calls continued, but they seemed frustrated now, searching for a target that kept shifting location. I could hear them communicating their confusion in the patterns of their calls, the way their voices would search and then lose me, only to search again in a different direction. But there was a cost to this strategy. The unpredictability didn't destroy my stress, it amplified it. I was never resting, never safe, never able to establish a secure perimeter. I was running on 8 hours of sleep spread across 5 nights, eating minimally, staying focused on movement and evasion. On the 4th day, my vision started to blur. My hands trembled constantly. I began to see things that weren't there. Movement in the periphery that resolved into trees, voices in the sound of wind that resolved into no voices at all. On the 5th day of my self-imposed exile from the cabin, I was crossing a high meadow when I felt something like a presence behind me. Not the creatures. Something else. I turned to see a ranger on horseback, moving toward me at a walk. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The presence of another human in this place felt more surreal than the creatures had. As he got closer, I realized it was someone I recognized from briefings, Marcus, a ranger from the main station. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his whole life in mountain country. "Josephine sent me," he said when he reached me. He didn't get off the horse. "She says you're having a crisis up here." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I wanted to tell him everything, about the handprints and the wrong-jointed animals, and the creatures with human faces that didn't quite fit. But something stopped me. Some instinct that had developed over the last 10 days told me that what I was experiencing wasn't something that could be explained to someone who hadn't lived it. "I'm managing," I said. Marcus studied me for a long moment, and his expression shifted into something I recognized: pity. "You can't kill it," he said finally. "I mean, you can try. Rangers before you have tried. But it's not the kind of thing that dies the way normal animals die. You have to understand, it's not really an animal at all. It's something else. Something old. Something that's been here longer than any of us. How do you stop it? I asked. You don't stop it, Marcus said. You coexist with it. You learn its patterns, and it learns yours, and you find ways to live in the same space without triggering a hunt. Most of the rangers who go to the remote posts either figure that out or they leave, and the ones who don't figure it out, Marcus didn't answer. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. He handed it down to me. Sweetgrass and sage, he said, and cedar. Burn it in the cabin. Keep a fire going in the stove. The creatures don't like the smoke. They won't come inside if you maintain the barriers. Josephine sent you to tell me this? Josephine sent me to find you, Marcus said. What I tell you is on me. She'd rather not know. The Park Service would rather not know, but you're going to last longer if you understand the actual situation you're in. He paused. Joseph Medicine Bird, he's the elder who consulted on this decades ago. He said the creatures protect the land from certain kinds of people, poachers, those who would take without respect, but they also test anyone who comes to live here. They need to know if a human can learn to live in balance with the wild, or if you're just another take-taker. I understood what he was saying. This wasn't an attack. It was an evaluation. The fire, I said. That's the main protection? That and not breaking the rules. Don't leave after dark. Don't establish a routine that's so rigid they can predict you but so chaotic they feel threatened. Don't try to hunt them, and whatever you do, don't ever try to directly harm one. The moment you become a threat to them rather than a test subject, they'll stop being interested in learning you and start being interested in killing you. Marcus shifted in his saddle. Your predecessor understood that. He lasted 2 seasons, then he requested a transfer and never came back. Marcus left me with the herbs and directions back to the cabin. He said he'd tell Josephine I was stable and managing. He said I should feel free to radio anytime I needed supplies or support, but that it would probably be better for everyone if I didn't become a regular voice on the line. I walked back to the cabin as evening was falling. I gathered wood, lots of wood. I cleaned every inch of the stove, and I burned that bundle of herbs continuously, filling the cabin with smoke that was pungent and strange and, I realized, vaguely familiar. I'd smelled that combination before in the territory before things went wrong. It was the smell of protection, of a boundary marked by something that wasn't fear or force but respect. That night I slept in my own bed for the first time in 5 days, and the creatures did not approach. I could hear them in the distance, their keening calls moving through the forest, but they didn't come to the cabin. The smoke held them off. I spent the rest of my 2-month posting in a state of negotiated coexistence with the things that moved through my sector. I maintained the fires, I kept the herbs burning, I established routines that were consistent but variable enough not to be fully predictable. I moved through my ranger duties with careful attention to protocol, marking the kills I found. There were 5 more over the summer, and filing reports that were technically accurate but deliberately vague about the circumstances. The creatures continued to move through the territory. I could hear them at night, but they never approached the cabin. Occasionally I'd see one of them, always at a distance, always in the deeper parts of the forest where I'd ventured off routine. I was being watched. I was being studied. And I understood that I was being judged. Then came a test that was different from all the others. I found a young boy in the forest, actually on my property, in the 3rd week of August. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He was wearing a Glacier National Park Ranger badge on his shirt, a toy one, plastic and poorly painted, and he was lost. The moment I saw him, I knew this was a test, not a real boy. One of the creatures wearing stolen shape, pulled from memory or observation of humans until it had constructed something that looked almost perfectly human except for the eyes. The eyes were dark, interested, wrong. I'm lost. The thing said in a voice that was almost right. Almost. I could kill it. I had a knife and bear spray and a rifle in the cabin. I could end this simulation right now and destroy this attempt to understand humanity by mimicking it. But killing it would mean breaking the agreement I'd made with my territory. It would mean declaring myself a threat. Instead, I knelt down. I asked the thing, still in the shape of a boy, what its name was. It made up a name on the spot. Kyle. It told me a story about hiking with his parents and getting separated. The story was perfectly structured, the kind of narrative a real child would construct under stress. The creature was good. It had learned something about human nature. I picked it up and carried it back toward the main trails, and as I walked, I felt the presence of the actual creatures in the forest around me. They were watching, observing how I treated the one wearing the stolen form. This was the real test. I deposited the thing, Still wearing Kyle's face, still telling its story with almost perfect authenticity, at a trail marker near the main road. I radioed into the station and reported finding a lost child. Within an hour, actual rangers arrived. They found the thing still in its human shape but only barely. When I look at the ranger report afterward, they described finding a confused animal on the trail. They tranquilized it, took it to a wildlife rehabilitation center, and reported back that it turned out to be a young grizzly with some kind of neurological condition affecting its behavior. It was euthanized. I never learned what actually happened to it, or whether the rangers had told the truth or covered up something stranger. But that night, the keening calls in the forest sounded different, less investigative, more accepting. I had passed the test. I had been offered an opportunity to commit violence, to attempt domination, and instead I had chosen mercy. I had shown the creatures that a human could be trusted to exercise power without using it, that there was a kind of person who could live in balance with a place and its mysteries. My 2-month posting ended in late September. The helicopter came to retrieve me. Before I left, I performed a ritual I'd never done at the cabin before. I burned the entire remaining bundle of herbs in a way that seemed like gratitude rather than necessity. I left my name scratched beside Marcus's on the support beam. Dakota lived here, learned here, became something more. And I boarded the helicopter with a sense of relief and loss so intense I couldn't tell them apart. I came back to Glacier the next summer, and the next. For 6 years I returned to that North Sector cabin. The creatures never fully revealed themselves again, but I came to understand their presence the way a person understands the rhythms of their own breathing, not visible but essential, a constant note in the ecology of the place. What I learned was this. The wilderness isn't empty, it's full of things that exist in the spaces between human understanding. Things that are neither good nor evil, but ancient. Things that have seen species come and go, that have learned to coexist with the cycles of an indifferent world. And sometimes, if you're very quiet, and very respectful, and very willing to understand that you're not the center of everything, they'll let you live in those spaces too. Some rangers never return after their remote postings. Some request immediate transfers. Some, like me, keep returning because they understand they've learned something that can't be unlearned. They've been tested by something deeper than civilization, and they've survived by respecting boundaries they didn't construct. I took another job, eventually a supervisory position at the main station. But every summer when I can manage it, I go back to that cabin at Hidden Lake. I bring sweetgrass and sage. I burn them in the stove. And at night, when the keening calls drift through the forest, I listen and remember. I am a guest in this place, I always will be, and that's exactly what survival means. 23 years later, I still work in wildlife management at Glacier. I'm considered an expert on predator behavior in the North Sector. I've mentored 43 rangers who've posted at remote stations. Most of them leave after their rotation, a few return, like I did. Last month, a ranger named Marcus contacted me. Not the Marcus who brought me the herbs, he retired long ago, but a young ranger who'd just finished his first month at the North Sector cabin. He asked if we could meet. We had coffee at a diner in St. Mary, and he described almost exactly what I'd experienced. The strange animal kills, the keening calls, the sense of being observed and tested. I told him about the herbs. I told him about coexistence, and I told him that the thing moving through his territory wasn't a problem that needed solving. It was a boundary, a teacher and a guardian all at once. How do you know you survived? He asked me. How do you know you didn't just imagine all of it? Stress and isolation creating a narrative. I thought about that for a while, about the handprints that I'd photographed, evidence that had disappeared from the park records, about the creature I'd left at the trail marker. The one the rangers said was a bear with a neurological condition. You know, I finally said, I don't know. But I know that believing the threat was real kept me alive. And I know that respecting the boundary kept me sane. Whether the creatures are literal or metaphorical doesn't change the fact that the wilderness is a place that demands a particular kind of relationship from you. Some people never figure out what that relationship should be. Some people do. And you? He asked. What's your relationship with it now? I thought about the cabin, about the smoke rising from the stove on winter nights, about the sound of those calls moving through the forest just beyond the boundary of what I understand. I'm a student, I said finally. I came to that place trying to disappear, trying to hide from my own failure. Instead, I learned to live with something I couldn't control or fully understand, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. The young ranger left satisfied but not reassured. He'll learn what I learned. or he'll leave and never return. Either way, Hidden Lake and the things that move through its territory will continue their ancient work. Watching, testing, deciding who belongs in the wild and who doesn't. I accepted the job at Glacier because I was broken. What I discovered was that brokenness and wilderness have something in common. Both demand honesty. Both reveal you to yourself. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, they'll teach you how to become whole again. I took the job at Glacier National Park because I was running from someone, not a person, myself. After 12 years with the Forest Service in Oregon, I'd become the kind of ranger who stopped seeing the wilderness and started seeing only the paperwork, performance reviews, budget cuts, quarterly reports. The mountains had become a backdrop for bureaucracy, and I couldn't stand the way my own reflection looked when I caught it in the ranger station mirrors. My name is Carson, just Carson now. I dropped the first name 5 years ago when my marriage collapsed, though I keep it on the official documents. I'm 47, with the kind of weather-beaten face that comes from 2 decades of early mornings and rough conditions. I was good at my job: search and rescue, wildlife management, backcountry patrols, the kind of ranger people trust with their lives. Glacier called with a position in the remote northern districts. The posting was specific. They needed someone for the Pole Bridge Ranger Station, a small outpost near the North Fork. The region had gone understaffed for 3 seasons, and there had been complications. The previous ranger, Marcus, had requested transfer after 14 months. When I asked what kind of complications, the interview panel exchanged glances and talked around it. Unusual wildlife behavior, difficult terrain, isolated posting, they called it, as if the isolation itself was something to manage. I didn't ask follow-up questions. Isolation was exactly what I wanted. The cabin they'd assigned me sits 2 miles east of Kintla Lake, accessible only by maintained trail or backcountry routes. Built in 1956, it's solid log construction with a stone fireplace, a well that rarely runs dry, and enough isolation to make the nearest human contact feel like a memory. Solar panels installed sometime in the 2010s keep the radio equipment functional. There's a satellite phone, though the battery is temperamental. I arrived in late August as the light began shifting. Longer shadows, earlier dusk, that peculiar quality to the air that tells you the season is already turning. The cabin's previous occupant, a seasonal ranger named Yuki, helped me understand the local patterns. She was younger, maybe 30, and spoke carefully, as though weighing each word. "The animals are strange this year," she said, helping me unload boxes from the truck. "Stranger than previous years, I mean. The elk are wound up. We've had reports of them being aggressive near the main trails. That's not typical for this elevation. Probably just rut season creeping in early," I said, but I was watching her face. Maybe. She didn't sound convinced. "There are also the sounds." That got my attention. In wilderness areas, sound is currency. "What kind of sounds?" "At night. Vocalizations we haven't identified. The research team thought they might be predators, but..." She trailed off, looking out toward the darkening tree line beyond the cabin. "The pattern's wrong. Predators don't usually call like that. It's almost rhythmic. Almost like..." She stopped herself. "Like what?" "Nothing. Probably just wind through the canyons. Sound travels strangely up here." She left the next morning. I haven't seen her since. That first week I settled into the rhythm of the posting. Morning equipment checks, afternoon patrols, evening radio reports. The cabin had a library of previous ranger logs stretching back 3 decades. I read through them carefully, looking for patterns. Most entries were mundane: animal sightings, trail conditions, weather observations. But certain entries caught my attention. From 1998, a ranger named Douglas had written, "Third elk found today with extensive wounds. Predation pattern inconsistent with bear or cougar attack. Lacerations appear made by multiple small wounds rather than puncture grip. Animals may have been struggling against restraint." From 2003, another entry, "Search for lost hiker Patricia Donovan, age 63. Last seen on Gunsight Pass Trail. Search parties organized for day 1-4. No remains or evidence located. Weather deteriorated on day 3. Presumed lost to fall or exposure. Satellite imagery of canyon floor inconclusive." From 2009, a ranger named Victor. "Unusual elk behavior observed. Herd movement patterns, erratic, clustering and dispersing without apparent triggers. 4 animals found separated from the group, all showing signs of extreme dehydration despite proximity to water sources. Unable to approach animals due to aggressive posturing. Consulted with regional wildlife biologist, inconclusive, recommend monitoring. The entries tapered off after 2015, becoming more careful, less descriptive. By 2020, they were almost sterile in their brevity. I'm trained to recognize patterns, to see the thread that connects disparate observations into something coherent. But looking at those logs in my first weeks at the cabin, I couldn't quite isolate the pattern. There was something, though. An unease that previous rangers had felt and documented around the margins of their official observations. By early September, I began to understand what they meant. The vocalizations started on September 3rd, which I noted because it was the first genuinely cold night. Temperatures dropped to 34 degrees, and I built a fire in the stone fireplace more for the ritual of it than the necessity. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. Not howling. I know what wolves and coyotes sound like. I've heard both in multiple forests across multiple states. This was different. It was structured, a pattern of calls that rose and fell with almost deliberate phrasing, high-pitched, but not shrieking. There was something almost melodic about it, the way it modulated through different tones. It started from somewhere northwest, near the ridge that overlooks the cabin, and continued for approximately 8 minutes before stopping abruptly. Silence followed that felt deliberately imposed, like something had simply switched off. I sat by the fire, coffee cooling in my hands, and thought about Yuki's careful words, about Marcus's transfer request, about rangers who read the logs but didn't add to them, who completed their postings and moved on without documenting the full scope of what they'd experienced. The vocalizations became regular. Every night, between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., they would occur somewhere in the surrounding forest. The location varied, sometimes northeast, sometimes south, once very close to the cabin, near enough that I stood on the porch with my flashlight and rifle, searching the tree line without seeing anything. What struck me most was the intentionality of the sound. It had rhythm. It had structure. It sounded, I began to think during those sleepless nights, almost like language. In mid-September, I was called to assist with a search operation. A group of 6 hikers had become separated from their tour during the afternoon along the Bowman Lake Trail. 3 of the 6 had returned to the main parking area and alerted rangers. The other 3, a young couple and an older man, were missing. The search started at dawn. I was paired with a younger ranger named Abbott, probably early 30s. With the lean efficiency of someone who actually enjoyed the physical demands of the job. We worked the trail methodically, checking sight lines, examining vegetation disturbance patterns, calling the hikers' names at regular intervals. By late morning, we found the first piece of evidence, a jacket, dark blue, belonging to one of the missing hikers. It was hung approximately 7 feet up in a lodgepole pine, carefully draped over a branch, not caught or snagged, deliberately placed. Abbott stared at it. Why would someone do that? Lost person might have marked it, I suggested, but I didn't believe it. The placement was too precise, too deliberate. We continued searching. By 2 p.m. we found another item, a hiking boot, size 11, laying in the middle of the trail approximately half a mile further down. Just sitting there, right in the center of the path, as though placed during a moment when no one was watching. This is wrong, Abbott said. He was young enough to still trust his instinct without questioning it. We called for backup. 3 additional rangers arrived by late afternoon. The search expanded. We widened our perimeter, checked all accessible areas around the trail, sent teams in both directions to cover more ground. What we found would be documented in the official report as evidence suggesting a fall into the canyon with rapid water dispersal. But that wasn't the truth of what we found, and every ranger on that search team knew it. We found blood. A lot of it, smeared across rocks near an overlook above Bowman Lake, about 200 feet down the trail from where the boot was discovered. The pattern was wrong for a simple fall. The spray suggested movement, struggle, extended contact. There were fragments embedded in the rocks that I didn't examine too closely. Fragments that looked like bone but that none of us wanted to identify. There was no body. No remnants of clothing beyond what we'd already found. Just the blood, the implications of violence, and a growing sense that what had happened to those hikers was not something we were equipped to explain. The official report cited a hiking accident involving a fall. 2 of the 3 missing hikers were officially presumed deceased. The 3rd was never accounted for. I signed the documentation, and I did not write down what I was thinking. That night, back at my cabin, I sat in the dark and listened to the vocalizations from the ridge. They sounded different to me now, not just structured, but purposeful. almost as though whatever was making them was aware that I had been searching for a missing person. Almost as though the sounds were acknowledgement. October arrived with early snow and the certainty that I was not imagining things. The vocalizations had increased in frequency. They came from different locations, sometimes so close to the cabin that I could hear them clearly from inside, the sound carrying through the gaps in the log walls. I had stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch. The logs and ranger records provided little guidance because no previous ranger had documented what I was beginning to understand. I read about Algonquin folklore, Wendigo legends, the accounts compiled by anthropologists and historians. The creature described in those sources was impossibly large, a being of starvation and cold and hunger given physical form, a manifestation of winter's cruelty. Most folklore I could dismiss. Most mythology I could contextualize as cultural artifact, metaphor rather than literal threat. But what I was experiencing was different. It was real in ways that defied neat categorization. On October 18th, someone came to the cabin. I was inside, maintaining the water system and restocking supplies, when I heard the knock on the door. Not a polite knock, a heavy, demanding sound. The kind of knock that implied the person doing it had no doubt they would be answered. When I opened the door, I found a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, perhaps 6', with the kind of weathered face that comes from a lifetime outdoors. His clothes were expensive, recent Patagonia gear, high-end hiking boots, the kind of outfit that costs more than my monthly salary. But they were torn and filthy, caked with dirt and worse substances I couldn't identify. "I need help," he said. His voice was hoarse, as though he'd been screaming. I brought him inside. His name was Marcus Verne, the Marcus who had been posted here before me, though he didn't mention his prior assignment initially. He'd been hiking alone, he said, doing a 3-day backpacking trip out of Polebridge. He'd become separated from the trail during the afternoon of the previous day. He'd been wandering, unable to relocate the main path, unable to get reliable cell service, until he finally saw my cabin light in the distance. His story was plausible. His conditions supported it. But something about his presence was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I gave him coffee. I called the ranger station to confirm that yes, there had been a report of a solo hiker overdue in the area. I offered him a shower and clean clothes while I dried his belongings. That's when I noticed the marks on his back. When he pulled his shirt off to go into the shower, I saw them. Thin, precise lines, like scratches but too geometric, too purposeful. They formed a pattern across his shoulders and down his spine, a pattern that might have been random scarring from trauma, except that it was far too symmetrical. I didn't ask about them. He didn't mention them. He stayed the night. I kept the rifle in my reach while I sat by the fire, pretending to read while listening to him move around in the guest room. I heard him get up around 2 a.m. I heard him go to the window. I heard him press his face against the glass and make a sound, not words, but a sound, toward the darkness outside. When I turned on my flashlight and moved toward the room, he was back in bed, apparently asleep. In the morning, Marcus told me he felt better. The rest had helped. He could make his way back to the trailhead. He didn't need me to call for assistance. He just needed directions. I gave him a map. I explained the easiest route back to Polebridge, the trail markers to watch for, the water sources along the way. He listened carefully, nodding at each instruction. At the door, he turned back and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're going to hear it more now," he said. "In the nights. It's coming closer. That's because of me. I brought it with me when I came back." "Marcus, what are you?" "It was always here. But when I was here before, it knew me, it learned me. And now that I've come back, after being gone, it remembers. It wants to know if I brought anything interesting with me. It wants to know about the new ranger." "I'm going to contact the ranger station," I said. "I think you need medical attention." He smiled. It was a horrible smile, not unkind, but deeply wrong. "That won't help. It doesn't matter where you go. It's not really a place anymore. It's more of a pattern now, a hunger. It moves through the forest because the forest is its shape." He left before I could respond further. I watched him walk away from the cabin, moving with that same hoarse sound under his breath, moving downslope toward the trail that would lead him away from Kintla Lake. I called the ranger station immediately. I reported his departure. I provided descriptions. I said nothing about what he'd claimed, because I had no framework in which to report it. 2 days later, park rangers found his abandoned hiking gear at Polebridge. They never found Marcus himself. The official report filed him under missing person presumed deceased, exactly like the 3 hikers from Bowman Lake. His disappearance was attributed to exposure and disorientation. His family was contacted. His case went cold. The vocalizations that night were louder than they'd ever been. They came from all directions simultaneously, north, south, east, west. They surrounded the cabin in layers of sound, each call offset slightly from the others, creating an almost harmonic effect. It lasted for 43 minutes. I counted. When it stopped, I was certain it had been directed at me. Not as threat, though threat was implicit. As recognition, as acknowledgement of something understood between us. I didn't sleep that night. I spent it reinforcing the cabin's locks and inventory, checking my supplies. The weather deteriorated through late October, pushing toward early winter. Snow came in waves, melting during warm afternoons, refreezing during clear nights. The electrical systems of the cabin began to fail, the solar panels iced over, the battery backup weakened. I was relegated to oil lamps and a backup generator that I rationed carefully. The vocalizations never stopped. They became part of the ambient landscape, as much a feature of the environment as wind or water. I stopped fearing them. Instead, I began to study them, recording them on a high-quality digital recorder, playing them back, attempting to identify patterns within the patterns. What I discovered was structure beyond what I'd initially perceived. There were phrases, repetitions. It was as though something was attempting to communicate in a medium that approximated language without being actual language, as though it understood that language was what I would recognize as intelligence, and it was deliberately imitating that structure to acknowledge my presence. On October 29th, I received a visitor from the ranger station. Dispatch had authorized a welfare check, concerned about the length of my isolation combined with the string of disappearances. The ranger who came was new, someone I hadn't met before. Her name was Keats. She was competent and professional. She reviewed my logs, checked the cabin systems, assessed my physical and mental condition with the kind of practiced skill that suggested she'd done this many times before. She did not seem surprised by anything I told her, nor did she dismiss my concerns about the vocalizations. "We know about the sounds," she said, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "The previous rangers reported them. We've had wildlife biologists attempt to identify the source. None of them could. What do you think is making them?" She hesitated. Then, "I think something is living in this area that shouldn't be. I think it's successful at avoiding detection. I think it may be predatory. I think it has some form of intelligence that allows it to manipulate human behavior." That's quite a statement for someone from Park Services. I'm not speaking officially. Officially, we classify unexplained vocalizations as likely to be wildlife producing unusual calls due to environmental stress or seasonal factors. She took a sip of tea. "But my personal opinion is that this posting is dangerous in ways that go beyond standard wilderness hazards." "Why keep rangers here at all then?" "Because if we don't maintain a presence, people won't stay away. The park is public land. Hikers come. Without ranger stations, without visible management, more people would come and more would disappear. At least this way we monitor it. We have some control." She stayed one night. Before she left, she gave me a piece of paper with information on it. Contact information for a researcher at the University of Montana, someone who had published work on behavioral anomalies in wildlife around sensitive ecosystems. She suggested that if I decided to compile my observations into a more formal document, this researcher might be interested. "Also," Keats said as she was leaving, "if you ever feel unsafe, actually unsafe in terms of your personal security, don't hesitate to call in a request for immediate reassignment. The Park Service will honor it. That's not in my official capacity, but I'm telling you anyway." After she left, I was alone again with the vocalizations and the snow and the particular darkness that comes with October turning into November in a place where winter closes in with absolute inevitability. I began to notice something new. The animals in the surrounding area were behaving abnormally. The elk herds that normally moved through the area in early fall had vanished. I hadn't seen tracks in weeks. The smaller animals, ground squirrels, marmots, were absent. Even the birds had diminished in number, as though every living thing with the ability to flee had done so. What remained were the sounds at night. And something else I began to detect, movement in the woods that seemed to follow no pattern of animal behavior I understood. Long, gliding movements. Paths that appeared and disappeared inexplicably. Once, looking out at dawn, I found tracks in the snow around the cabin's perimeter. They were irregular, sometimes following the ground, sometimes jumping up to trail across the top of rocks as though the creature leaving them could move across surfaces no human could navigate. By November 3rd, the isolation had become total. Heavy snow cut off the trail to Polebridge. The satellite phone's battery had finally expired, and my attempts to repair it using the cabin's backup power system failed. The radio equipment still functioned, but the static was overwhelming. When I attempted to make contact, my signal seemed to scatter into the interference, my words breaking apart and becoming unintelligible. On November 4th, I made the decision to leave. I packed supplies. I prepared the cabin for extended closure, securing the windows, banking the fire. I would hike out to the main trailhead. The distance was significant in winter conditions, but I was trained for it. The risk seemed worth taking. I never made it past the first 2 miles. The woods between the cabin and the trail became something else as I walked through them. Not physically transformed. The trees were still trees, the terrain still followed the contours I knew. But the quality of the space was altered. The snow seemed deeper than it should have been. The distances distorted. I'd walk toward what I knew was a creek bed, only to find myself moving deeper into unfamiliar territory. More than that, I was being watched. Not observed passively, but watched with focused attention. I could feel the weight of that observation the way you feel changes in air pressure, not directly but as an alteration in the environment itself. I backtracked. It took me nearly 3 hours of careful navigation to return to the cabin, though the outbound journey had taken 40 minutes. The trees seemed to be arranged differently, though I recognized specific landmarks that should have been unmoved. Inside the cabin, I made a choice. Instead of running, I would face what was here. Instead of attempting to survive outside, I would document everything and wait. I compiled my observations into a document. I described the sounds, the patterns of missing persons, the abnormal animal behavior, the territorial markers, Marcus's cryptic words, the altered space of the forest. I recorded several hours of the nightly vocalizations. I photographed the tracks I'd found in the snow. I compiled everything into a journal that I placed in a sealed box hidden in the cabin's stone fireplace, accessible but not immediately discoverable. Then I waited. The vocalizations came that night, but they were different. They came from inside the tree line very close to the cabin. They came in layers, multiple voices creating a harmonic structure that was almost musical, almost beautiful if beauty didn't carry the weight of absolute wrongness. I understood then what Marcus had meant about it being a pattern, not a place. What was making these sounds wasn't a creature moving through the forest, it was the forest itself creating sound. The arrangement of trees, the configuration of space, the interplay of wind through the specific topography of this location had created something that could think, in a way, something that had learned to use the landscape as its body. On November 8th, 3 hikers attempted to enter the wilderness on the trail near Polebridge. The search began immediately. By the second day, 2 of the hikers had been found, hypothermic and experiencing memory loss, unable to coherently describe what had happened to their companion. The 3rd hiker was never located. Over the next week, I maintained the cabin. I ate the supplies. I listened to the sounds. I documented everything in my journal. I began to understand that I was not in danger, at least not immediate physical danger. The thing using the forest as its voice was curious about me. Marcus's return had introduced a variable, and now that variable's replacement, myself, was under examination. On November 15th, something remarkable happened. The sounds stopped. For the first time in weeks, the night was completely silent. The absence was so profound that I found it more disturbing than the presence had been. I stayed awake, listening to the quiet, understanding that silence in a wilderness area is never truly natural. Silence is what something produces when it has stopped speaking. At dawn, I found a path that hadn't existed before. It ran directly from my cabin, straight through the forest, toward the northwest ridge where the vocalizations had most often originated. The snow was compressed here, hardened and smooth, creating a surface that looked almost intentionally prepared. I followed it. The path led deeper into territory I'd never hiked before, yet it felt inevitable, as though I'd always known where it would go. The trees opened into a clearing I didn't recognize. In the center of the clearing was a structure that couldn't exist. A cabin, older than mine, constructed of logs that had partially rotted, surrounded by objects I couldn't immediately comprehend. Remains, equipment from missing persons, clothing, belongings, organized in concentric circles around the old structure, decades of accumulation, probably more than 100 different artifacts, and standing at the center, visible in the entrance of the old cabin, was a figure. It was humanoid, but wrong, too tall, the proportions subtly inverted. Its face was unclear, as though my eyes couldn't quite focus on it, as though any direct observation of its features was rejected by my mind. It made the sound then, the vocalization I'd heard so many times, but not at distance, from 3 feet away. And in that sound, I understood everything. It was showing me, not threatening, showing the truth of what had happened here, the truth of what it was and what it had become and why it persisted in this specific place. It was an intelligence born from something, catastrophe or curse or evolutionary anomaly that had learned to survive by inhabiting the landscape itself, by becoming the forest's strange heart, by using sound to think and hunger to move. The figure lifted what might have been an arm, what might have been something else entirely, and gestured toward the artifacts. A moment of choice, I realized. It was offering me the choice to document this, to tell the truth, or to continue as I had been. I turned and walked back toward the cabin. I didn't run. I walked deliberately, understanding that the path would guide me correctly this time. When I returned to the clearing the next morning, it was gone. The path had disappeared. The snow was undisturbed, unmarked by footprints. The clearing itself had reverted to the surrounding forest, indistinguishable from the landscape around it. I never found that old cabin again. The vocalizations resumed that night, but they were quieter now, more distant. They came less frequently. By November 25th, they had almost stopped entirely, reduced to occasional sounds from the deep forest that could almost be explained as wind or distant wolves. On December 1st, the snowpack was dense enough for snowmobile travel. The ranger station authorized my extraction. I left the cabin with minimal supplies, taking only my journal and the recordings and the sealed box I would later retrieve and deliver to the researcher at the university. The official report stated that I had completed a successful posting, contributed valuable observations about wilderness management and predator behavior, and requested transfer due to the isolation's psychological toll. I received a commendation for my work with the missing persons searches. I was reassigned to a less isolated location. What I did not include in any official documentation is what I know, that Glacier National Park is home to something that cannot be explained by conventional zoology or biology, that it is intelligent in ways our current science cannot accommodate, that it has learned to communicate using language patterns, to influence human behavior, to exist in a way that makes physical presence almost irrelevant, that it, whatever it is, chose to let me leave. I sometimes listen to the recordings of the vocalizations. I sometimes look at the photographs of the tracks. I sometimes consider sending the documentation to the researcher Keats recommended, but mostly I keep quiet about what I experienced at Kintla Lake. I tell myself it's discretion. I tell myself it's protecting the park's reputation. I tell myself it's because no one would believe it anyway. What I actually believe is that I made an implicit bargain in that clearing, that something ancient and vast and permanently tied to that specific corner of the wilderness decided I was worth sparing, that in exchange I maintain silence. Some nights when I'm alone in my new posting hundreds of miles away, I still hear the vocalizations in the spaces between my thoughts. I don't think that's a memory. I think that's a reminder of what I saw, of what I chose not to fully report, of what still exists in those mountains, waiting in the patterns of the forest, thinking in the language of wind and snow, and the terrible intelligence of a place too old and too strange for human understanding. The Algonquin peoples knew this. The folklore was not metaphor, it was documentation, it was warning, and I, who once thought I was running from myself, discovered I was running directly toward the only truth that mattered. That some parts of the world are not ours to understand, they are only ours to navigate, if we are fortunate and careful and willing to accept that some experiences should never be fully shared. That is what remains in me from my time at Glacier. Not fear, not trauma, but the absolute certainty that the wild places still belong to something we cannot name, cannot categorize, cannot defeat. And that is, perhaps, exactly how it should be. My name is Dakota Reeves. I accepted this position because I needed to disappear, not in the criminal sense. I needed to vanish from the world that had been suffocating me for the last 3 years, ever since the incident at the consulting firm in Denver. I won't detail that here. What matters is that I was drowning in fluorescent office lighting and the weight of knowing too much about how corporations quietly exploit people. At 34, I'd already developed stress-related hypertension. My doctor said I had maybe 2 years before I'd have a heart attack if I didn't change something fundamental. A recruiter from the National Park Service found me through a job board I'd forgotten I'd posted on. The position was perfect in its isolation. Backcountry ranger for Yellowstone National Park's Shoshone Lake District. Mostly solo work, high elevation, remote cabin, minimal human contact. The job description listed patrols, wildlife monitoring, trail maintenance, and assisting lost hikers. It sounded like meditation with a purpose. I took the position immediately. My supervisor, Marcus, trained me for 2 weeks in early September. He was in his 50s, competent, with the weathered skin of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. During our final briefing at the ranger station near the Shoshone Lake access road, he handed me a leather-bound patrol logbook and a sat phone that worked only in emergencies. "Keep it simple," Marcus said, checking my emergency supplies for the third time. "Cabin needs firewood split before November. Check the Southern Trail system twice weekly. Report any signs of poaching. If you encounter a bear, make noise and back away. If it charges, use the bear spray." If the spray fails, he trailed off, but I understood the implication. "And if something seems off," he continued, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that seemed unwarranted, "trust that instinct. The backcountry has a way of revealing things to people who listen. Not everything can be documented in a report." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer directly. "You'll understand eventually," he said. "The last ranger who had this post stayed for 3 seasons. Good man, very observant. He left because he said the district had developed a presence. His words. He wouldn't elaborate beyond that." I should have asked more questions. The cabin sat on the western shore of Shoshone Lake at an elevation of 8,230 feet. It was a solid structure, roughly 400 square feet, with proper insulation and a wood stove. A dock extended from the rocky beach, and a small boathouse contained a motorized raft for emergency water patrols. The surrounding landscape was magnificent and brutal. Dense lodgepole pine forest interspersed with white bark pine and high meadows that turned gold in the afternoon light. The lake itself was clear and deep, reflecting mountains that still held patches of snow. My isolation began immediately. The access road became impassable by vehicle in late October. After that, visitors arrived only via backcountry trail or water, which meant essentially no one. The nearest other ranger station was 20 miles away through forest terrain. The nearest town was 50 miles west. For the first 3 weeks, the solitude felt like a solution. I split firewood, hiked the southern trails, noted wildlife activity in the logbook. I saw elk herds, mule deer, 1 black bear in the distance. A pair of gray wolves passed through the territory in the 3rd week, identifiable by their size and movement pattern. Everything followed expected patterns. Everything made sense. Then, in late September, I found something wrong. I was on the Blue Jay Trail, roughly 6 miles south of the cabin, when I noticed that all the birds had stopped singing. This is not metaphorical. The forest had been filled with the expected sounds of autumn: jays, chickadees, the occasional raven call. At approximately 2:15 p.m., as I rounded a bend near a small creek, that noise simply ceased. The forest didn't quiet gradually. It went silent as if someone had cut the audio feed. I stopped walking. The silence was profound enough to seem unnatural. My own breathing sounded loud. The crunch of my boots on pine needles was amplified. The air temperature seemed to have dropped. I waited for maybe 3 minutes, motionless. I expected the animal sounds to resume. They didn't. Instead, I became aware of something else. The feeling of being observed. Not the casual awareness you get when hiking in bear country. This was different. This was direct and focused. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Dense forest surrounded me, broken only by a few stands of dead trees from an old fire. Nothing moved, nothing was visible. But the sense of observation intensified. My training kicked in. I unclipped my bear spray, faced downslope, and began walking steadily back toward the cabin. I didn't run. Panic in the backcountry is how people die. But I walked fast, and I listened to every sound my surroundings made. The silence continued for the entire 6 miles back. When I reached the cabin, the normal forest sounds resumed. Birds called. I heard a distant elk bugle. The woods returned to their expected acoustic landscape. I locked the door, something I hadn't done since arriving, and sat for an hour with my logbook, attempting to write a rational explanation for what I'd experienced. Stress, I concluded. Projection. The human mind creates patterns and assigns meaning to randomness, especially in isolation. I'd been reading too much about Yellowstone's ecology. The silence was probably just a temporary wildlife response to something, a predator passing through, a storm building. Bears taught me that nature had ways of communicating danger that humans couldn't fully interpret. I wrote a calm, factual entry. September 28, Blue Jay Trail Patrol. All systems normal. Brief period of animal silence noted around 2:15 p.m., likely related to predator presence. Recommend continued observation. That night, I built a fire and tried to read. I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept returning to that quality of observation, that specific sensation of being watched by something that wasn't making its presence known through conventional means. Around midnight, I heard something unusual at the dock. A scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the wooden planks. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The dock was empty. The motorized raft was secured to its cleats. The water was dark and still, reflecting moonlight. Nothing appeared disturbed, but when I aimed my flashlight along the dock's surface, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The wooden planks showed deep scratch marks, 4 parallel lines, as if something with claws had dragged itself across the wood. The marks were fresh. The exposed wood beneath was still pale, not yet weathered. I measured them with my hand. Each claw mark was nearly an inch apart. No North American animal I could identify would leave those marks. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with the fire burning, the sat phone on the table beside me, and my logical mind in direct conflict with what my senses were reporting. By dawn, I'd convinced myself that the marks were pre-existing, that I'd simply not noticed them during daylight. Memory was unreliable. The scratch marks probably came from equipment maintenance or wildlife passing through during previous seasons. That's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. October arrived with cold temperatures and early snow at higher elevations. The work continued. Trail patrols, firewood management, wildlife documentation. The logbook filled with observations that seemed increasingly mundane once written down. 3 bull elk in the northeast sector. Beaver activity on Biscuit Creek. Weather system approaching from the west, but my actual experience of the territory was becoming something else entirely. The silence episodes intensified. They no longer lasted just minutes. A few times they stretched for hours. I'd be hiking or performing maintenance tasks, and the forest would simply go quiet. Not gradually. Instantly, as if someone had activated a switch. During these periods, I felt that observation more acutely. It wasn't malicious exactly. It was patient, curious, and the animals were behaving strangely. One morning, I found a young mule deer standing motionless beside the cabin, staring directly at my window. It didn't react when I opened the door. It didn't flee. It simply stood there, watching back, with an intensity in its posture that seemed wrong. The deer's posture wasn't defensive or aggressive. It looked almost mechanical, like something was operating it from inside. After maybe 10 minutes, it walked into the forest with stiff-legged movements. I watched it go, my intuition screaming. That same week, I encountered a black bear on the Promontory Trail. This wasn't unusual in itself. Black bears were common. What was unusual was its behavior. The bear didn't acknowledge me until I made noise and began backing away. Then it turned and moved parallel to my position, keeping roughly 30 feet distance, for the entire mile back to the trail junction. It didn't advance, it didn't flee, it matched my pace with an almost methodical precision. When I finally broke into the open area near the dock, it stopped at the tree line and watched until I reached the cabin. I called Marcus on the sat phone that evening. "I've encountered some unusual animal behavior," I said carefully. Static filled the line for a long moment. "Define unusual," Marcus said. His voice had changed. Where before it carried the easy confidence of someone secure in his authority, now it sounded measured. Careful, I described the episodes, the silences, the animals watching, the bear following. "You're not in danger," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I don't think so. But something is happening out here that doesn't fit standard wildlife patterns." "I know," Marcus said. "We know. We're aware of it. The question is what you're going to do about it." Do about what exactly? The presence, the thing that observes. It's existed in that territory for at least 40 years that we know of, possibly much longer. Our best understanding is that it's not aggressive toward humans unless they pose a specific threat. It's territorial, yes. It's curious, certainly. But it hasn't killed anyone in our records. What do you mean in our records? What is it? That's the part nobody can answer, Marcus said. We have reports, environmental disturbances, animal behavior patterns that suggest an organism of significant size and intelligence. We have photographs of tracks that don't match any catalog species. We have audio recordings that sound like, well, like nothing that should exist in Yellowstone. But we don't have a specimen. We don't have a corpse. We don't have definitive proof. What did the last ranger call it? You said he mentioned a presence. Robert, good man, like I said, he called it the Watcher, not because it made any scientific sense, but because that's what it did. It watched. He tracked instances of its activity for 3 seasons. He filled notebook after notebook with observations. When he left, he took those notebooks with him. Said the information wasn't safe to leave behind, that it raised implications about how the Park Service categorizes unknown wildlife. You're telling me the Park Service knows there's an unknown animal in this territory and we're keeping one ranger out here to observe it? I'm telling you that we employ rangers in remote territories to manage the wild spaces, and sometimes the wild spaces contain things we don't fully understand. The fact that you're perceiving its activity clearly means you're suitable for this position. Some rangers never notice anything unusual. They complete their tours and move on. They perceive only what their expectations prepare them to see. I wanted to ask why no one had told me this directly. I wanted to know what the Park Service planned to do with whatever information I gathered. I wanted to understand why I was being used as some kind of informal researcher without explicit consent. Instead, I asked, what should I do if it becomes aggressive? Use your judgment, Marcus said. Document everything, report any incidents, and Dakota, don't go searching for it deliberately. That changes the dynamic. Right now, you're an observer in its territory. The moment you become a hunter, the interaction shifts. The watcher doesn't tolerate threats. That's the one thing Robert was certain about. I didn't want that job description, but I understood it was already mine. The conversations I had with Marcus established a new baseline for my work at Shoshone Lake. I was no longer just a ranger, I was a monitor. The logbook entries I'd been writing casually now felt like they served a second purpose. Every observation was data. Every strange animal behavior was documentation. The silence episodes continued and became more frequent. By mid-October, I experienced them almost daily. They usually lasted between 30 minutes and 2 hours. During these periods, I maintained my routines but with heightened awareness. I'd split firewood or repair trails, conscious always of being watched, listening for any sound that didn't match expected forest noise. On October 17th, during an extended silence period, I noticed something at the edge of my vision, a movement in the woods, maybe 70 yards from the cabin. It was large, roughly human-shaped but wrong in its proportions. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there, but I caught a shadow moving between the trees, too quick and too coordinated to be coincidence. I went inside and wrote the entry in my logbook. October 17. Observed large form in forest approximately 70 yards northwest of cabin. Bipedal movement pattern, high speed, no visible identification. Recommend continued monitoring. That night, I heard it walking around the cabin. I could hear the heavy footfalls, the brush of its body against the brush and small trees surrounding the structure. It walked in a complete circuit around the building, taking what seemed like an hour to do so. Its breathing was deep and purposeful, close enough that I imagined I could hear the air moving in and out of its lungs through the cabin walls. When morning came, the silence broke. The birds returned. The forest resumed its normal acoustic landscape. I walked outside and found tracks. They were enormous. I'd estimate the length at 14 inches, possibly longer where the deeper portions had shifted the dirt. The print showed a clear foot structure, 5 toes, and claw marks. The stride length was nearly 4 feet. Using the measurements I could take from the prints, I estimated the height of the creature that made them at somewhere between 7 and 8 feet, with a weight probably exceeding 600 pounds. The prints circled the cabin exactly as I'd heard it walking, stopping occasionally as if the creature had paused to examine the structure more closely. I photographed the tracks with my Ranger camera, documented their measurements and locations, and uploaded everything to the Park Service database remotely. The response came within 6 hours. Marcus called. "We're sending a team," he said. "They'll arrive in 2 days. In the meantime, continue your regular patrols. Do not engage with the animal if you encounter it directly. Do not attempt to follow its tracks. Simply document activity and maintain normal operations." "A team?" I said. "What kind of team?" "Wildlife specialists. We want samples if possible. Hair, scat, saliva, anything that might provide DNA material for analysis." The thought of this thing being studied, contained, dissected, raised something protective in me that I couldn't quite name. I'd been terrified of it since my first week at the cabin, and yet knowing that armed specialists were coming to hunt it down created an unexpected sense of wrongness. "And what if it becomes aggressive when it senses the team moving through the territory?" I asked. "Then you help contain the threat," Marcus said. "That's part of your job." The team arrived on October 19th via helicopter. 3 people rappelled down near the clearing south of the cabin: Dr. Jerome Walsh, a wildlife biologist, Rebecca Quinn, a wildlife behavioral specialist, and Derek Moss, a park ranger with extensive experience in dangerous animal encounters. They brought equipment that suggested they'd known more about the target than they'd told me initially. Motion sensor cameras, thermal imaging devices, tranquilizer rifles, and what appeared to be audio recording equipment. They'd also brought a cage, disassembled into component parts. My small cabin became a staging area. We spent the first night reviewing my documentation, studying the track photographs, and listening to audio recordings I'd made during the silence episodes. The recordings were disturbing. They contained sounds that shifted between animal vocalizations and something that might almost have been language. Clicks, warbling tones, and a low-frequency hum that I could feel rather than hear. Fascinating, Dr. Walsh said, replaying the audio repeatedly. The frequency range suggests vocal complexity we wouldn't expect in an unknown primate species. The lower tones could indicate significant lung capacity. Could it be making an attempt at communication? I asked. Possibly, Rebecca said. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 20s, with an intensity in her eyes that reminded me of someone who'd seen things that had changed her perspective. Or it could be echolocation, or territorial marking, or stress response. We won't know until we have more data. They deployed the motion sensor cameras throughout the territory in a wide grid pattern. They set up audio recording stations at regular intervals. They took casts of the larger track prints. And they waited. For 2 days, nothing unusual occurred. The forest was quiet in its normal way. We encountered animals that behaved within expected parameters. My sense of being observed disappeared. The presence seemed to have withdrawn. On the morning of October 22nd, everything changed. The motion sensors had recorded something large moving through the territory just before dawn. A thermal image showed a bipedal form roughly 7 feet tall, crossing the meadow northeast of the cabin at approximately 4:47 a.m. Its body temperature registered significantly above normal mammalian expectations. The creature had moved with deliberate speed directly toward the recording station Derek had positioned in that meadow. The station's camera had captured images of the creature examining the equipment. The photographs were clear enough to see detail. The face was nothing I could reconcile with any animal taxonomy I knew. It was human enough in basic structure: 2 forward-facing eyes, a nose, a mouth. But the proportions were subtly alien. The eyes seemed too large. The jaw seemed too wide. The skin appeared mottled and pale in the thermal imaging. Most disturbing was the expression. In one photograph, the creature had turned directly to the camera, as if aware it was being observed. Its expression was not aggressive. It looked curious, almost sad. Derek immediately wanted to begin tracking. He was convinced the creature would return to the same location. Rebecca argued for patience, maintaining the monitoring network, allowing the animal to become accustomed to the presence of the equipment before any direct approach was attempted. "We're not here to capture it yet," Rebecca said. "We're here to understand it. Premature action could be dangerous for all of us." Derek didn't like that answer, but he accepted it. He was old-school Park Service, confident, experienced, but not subtle. That evening, as sunset painted the lake red and gold, the creature returned. This time, it walked directly toward the cabin. Derek had the tranquilizer rifle loaded and was positioned on the cabin roof. I watched from inside, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the sat phone. The creature emerged from the tree line maybe 50 yards from the cabin, moving with that same stiff-legged walk I'd observed in the mule deer. But the intelligence in its movements was undeniable. It was coming here deliberately. It came directly to the window where I stood. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The face was close enough that I could see the texture of its skin, the complexity of its eyes. It had no recognizable emotion, which somehow made it more frightening than rage would have been. It was simply observing me, studying, evaluating. Derek didn't wait for orders. He fired. The tranquilizer dart hit the creature's shoulder. The effect was not what anyone anticipated. The creature didn't stumble or show signs of sedation. It yanked the dart out with one massive hand, examined it with what seemed like genuine confusion, and then turned toward the cabin roof where Derek stood. Derek fired again. And again. 3 more tranquilizer darts struck the creature's chest and side. The creature's demeanor changed. It made a sound that will remain in my memory until the day I die. It was part scream, part roar, part something that had no name. It contained such a volume of emotion, such a concentration of something that transcended animal distress, that all of us in the cabin went very still. The creature dropped to all fours and moved toward the cabin door with shocking speed. Derek jumped from the roof and landed heavily, the impact probably breaking something in his legs. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh had already begun pushing furniture against the door. The creature hit the cabin wall with enough force to crack the frame. The structure shuddered. It hit again. I could hear the wood splitting, could feel the integrity of the building compromising under the repeated impacts. I made the decision that likely saved my life. I unlocked the back window, grabbed my emergency pack, and started moving toward the forest. Dr. Walsh shouted my name, but I was already outside, moving into the tree line as the front of the cabin began to give way. I ran through the forest in near darkness, branches striking my face, my breath burning in my lungs. Behind me, I heard the sounds of destruction, the crash of the cabin walls, Derek shouting, the creature's ongoing vocalization that had become something between a roar and a wail. I ran until my lungs couldn't process air any further, until my legs threatened to collapse, until I was far enough away that the sounds had diminished to almost nothing. Then I sat against a tree and waited for dawn. Morning brought no rescue, no reinforcements, no explanation. The sat phone had no signal this deep in the forest. I made my way back to the cabin area slowly, carefully, conscious that the creature might still be present. When I emerged into the meadow, the scene was one of devastation. The front wall of the cabin had essentially collapsed. The interior was exposed to the elements. Equipment was scattered everywhere. There was a trail of blood leading away into the forest toward the lake. No bodies, no obvious signs of casualties. I found Derek first. He was limping toward the dock, one leg clearly broken, his rifle abandoned in the cabin debris. His face was ashen, but his eyes were alert. "We have to go," he said immediately. "Now, where's Rebecca and Dr. Walsh?" "They went after it. Said they needed biological samples, that the dart wounds would be bleeding heavily. Said this was the only opportunity." "That's suicide." "Yes," Derek said, "but they went anyway." We made it to the motorized raft, and Derek managed to operate it despite his injury. We headed for the nearest ranger station, a small outpost on the lake's eastern shore. Along the way, Derek told me what had happened. The tranquilizer darts had worked partially. The creature had become disoriented but not incapacitated. Its aggression had escalated in response. When it crashed through the front wall, Rebecca had seized the opportunity to approach with collection equipment. Dr. Walsh had gone with her. They disappeared into the forest following the creature's trail. Derek, unable to move quickly with his injuries, had come to the lake to find a way to signal for help. We reached the ranger station and called Marcus immediately. The response was swift, almost as if this scenario had been anticipated. A helicopter arrived within 4 hours. We were evacuated with Derek receiving medical treatment for his broken femur and various lacerations. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh were never found. The official report stated that the team had ventured into dangerous terrain in pursuit of an unidentified animal and had become lost. Search and rescue efforts were conducted for 6 days but were called off due to unseasonable weather and uncertain terrain. Both scientists were presumed dead. No mention was made of the cabin's destruction, the motion sensor footage, the thermal images, or the recordings. No explanation was offered for what the creature might be or what would be done to address its presence in the park. I returned to civilization, to hotel rooms and hospital checkups and interviews with Park Service administrators who asked carefully neutral questions and documented everything I said. I was offered a generous settlement and assured of confidentiality agreements that were already being prepared. What I didn't receive was answers. A week after returning to society, I called Marcus. "What was it?" I asked simply. "We don't know," Marcus said. "We may never know. The creature exists in a space between categories. Its behavior suggests intelligence, but not human intelligence. It's capable of violence, but it's not inherently aggressive. It seemed almost to want contact with you specifically." "Why would it want contact with me?" "That's the part that keeps me awake at night," Marcus said. "Because the one reliable pattern in the observations is that it seeks out certain people. People who are searching for something. People running from something. People who are fundamentally broken in a way that makes them receptive to its presence." Robert noticed this pattern. He documented it extensively. He believed the creature was drawn to individuals in existential crisis, that it was somehow feeding on that state of being. Feeding? Maybe literally, maybe metaphorically. The point is, it seemed interested in who you were, not just your presence. And Rebecca and Dr. Walsh. Were they broken people? Rebecca had a history of self-harm. Dr. Walsh had been diagnosed with clinical depression that seemed untreatable through conventional means. So yes, broken people. I understood then why I'd been hired. I'd been selected because my depression and my existential crisis made me exactly the kind of person that would be capable of perceiving the creature's presence. I'd been used as a detector for something the Park Service couldn't adequately study. I never returned to Shoshone Lake. 6 months later, I was living in a small apartment in Missoula, Montana, attempting to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I worked remotely as a consultant for environmental agencies, I saw a therapist twice weekly. I was slowly learning to sleep through entire nights. And then, one evening in April, I felt it. The presence, the observation, the specific quality of attention that had defined my time in Yellowstone. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the room seemed to darken slightly, though all the lights were on. The ambient sound of the city outside my window diminished as if distance had suddenly increased. I didn't turn around, though I felt its presence behind me. The hairs on my forearms stood up. My breathing became shallow. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "For Derek firing. For the team trying to capture you. For any of that." The presence didn't move. It simply existed in the space it inhabited, observing, as always. "Why come here?" I asked. "Why follow me?" No answer came in words or sounds. Instead, I felt something else. A kind of resonance. A frequency that seemed to match something within me. Understanding came not through communication but through proximity, through the act of being observed by something that understood the specific nature of human suffering. It wasn't predatory attention, it was recognition. It was the sensation of being truly seen by something that existed outside the boundaries of normal perception. After what might have been seconds or hours, the presence withdrew. The city's sounds returned. The darkness lifted from the room. I was alone again, but I understood something that Marcus had been trying to tell me without explicitly saying it. The creature wasn't hunting us, it was answering. It came to people who had already lost themselves, to those of us searching for something that conventional existence couldn't provide. It offered contact with something so far outside the human experience that it forced a complete restructuring of how we understood reality itself. Whether that was a gift or a curse, I still don't know. I've accepted that I'll spend the rest of my life waiting for that presence to return. I've accepted that conventional life will always feel shallow compared to those months in the backcountry. I've accepted that I'm one of a handful of people on Earth who have looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, and lived to question whether it was mercy or malevolence that let me survive. The journal Marcus mentioned, Robert's notebooks, have never been made available to me. The Park Service maintains its official position that the incident was a tragic misadventure by a research team in difficult terrain. The satellite images, the motion sensor footage, the recordings, all of it has been classified beyond my access. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what watched me from the shadows of Yellowstone's backcountry, and somewhere in the vast wilderness of the West, it's still out there. Still observing, still waiting for the next person whose pain has carved out enough emptiness inside them to allow something truly foreign to take root. If you're reading this, if you've recognized yourself in my story, then you understand one fundamental truth. We are not alone in the wild places, and sometimes, if we're broken enough, lonely enough, lost enough, the wild places send us something to answer that loneliness. The only question that remains is whether that's the universe's most subtle form of mercy or its cruelest form of predation. I suspect the answer depends entirely on whether you survive the encounter with your sanity intact. My name is Cale, and I took this job because I needed to disappear for a while. That's the honest answer, the one I never gave during the interview at the ranger station in Harlan County, Kentucky. Instead, I told them I had always been drawn to wilderness work, that I respected conservation and had the physical capability to handle the demands of a remote post. Those things were technically true. What I didn't mention was the way my last job had ended, the accusation that never went to trial because the evidence was circumstantial, the way people looked at me afterward like I was something they couldn't quite identify but knew to avoid. The post they offered me was called the Ridge Keeper position, though the official title was Seasonal Ranger assigned to the North Pigeon backcountry. The name came from the old ways people in these mountains used to talk. The Ridge Keeper was the one who watched over the high places, who knew the land and made sure nothing crossed certain boundaries. When they explained this during my training, I felt something settle in my chest, a name that suggested isolation and purpose. A name that made the hiding feel like a job. The cabin sat at 3,100 feet elevation, a two-room structure with a fireplace, a propane stove, and a view of Blacksnake Lake that changed color with the weather. The lake was the entire reason for the post. It was a high alpine lake, clear and deep, located 3 miles up from the nearest maintained trail. Every summer, hikers reached it. Some got lost trying, some never made it back down. My job was to monitor the area, maintain the trail, and respond to distress calls. In theory, this meant I might interact with a handful of people per month. In practice, I was being paid to be alone with something. I understand that now, though I didn't understand it then. The Forest Service doesn't post rangers in remote locations for the sake of it. They had received reports. Official reports went into files, and those files had led them to the conclusion that this particular piece of land needed someone watching it. Someone familiar with the territory. Someone who wouldn't spook easily or leave before the season ended. Someone they wouldn't lose sleep over if he disappeared. I moved into the cabin on a Tuesday in late April, when the last snow was still visible on the north-facing ridges and the trees hadn't fully decided to green. The drive from town took 4 hours along increasingly narrow roads until I reached a parking area that was barely more than a turnout. From there, my gear went into a pack that weighed 60 pounds, and I walked the remaining trail alone. The cabin revealed itself gradually as I approached through the forest. At first, I saw only the weathered gray of the roof between the hemlocks, then the stone chimney, then the door, which was smaller than I expected, framed by windows that had been sealed with weathered plywood. The wood was old enough that the nails showed extensive rust. I stood outside for a full minute before I touched the door, and I couldn't explain to myself why I was hesitant. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood and something else. Something that might have been animal urine or might have been the smell of years passing without adequate ventilation. The furniture was minimal. A cot with a rolled mattress, a wooden table with one chair, shelves holding canned goods and propane lanterns. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust that made it clear no one had been here recently. The plywood on the windows blocked most of the daylight, leaving the interior in a permanent twilight that made me think of basements and underground places. I spent that first afternoon removing the plywood from the east-facing window. The nails came out reluctantly, and my hands developed blisters by the time I finished. When the plywood fell away, actual daylight flooded the cabin, and I could see the dust clearly, a visible layer coating every surface. I opened the door fully and let the place breathe while I took inventory of supplies and checked the equipment. There was a shortwave radio that actually functioned, a file containing the previous ranger's notes from 3 years ago, and in the bottom of the kitchen cabinet, a leather-bound journal with blank pages and an inscription on the inside cover. For the Ridgekeeper, from those who came before. The handwriting in that journal was the first indication that the previous rangers had understood something specific about this place. The most recent entry was dated September 1998, 8 years before my arrival. "They're getting bolder," the handwriting read, "or I'm getting more sensitive to it. The sounds from the lake at night aren't animals. Animals don't move the way these things move. Animals don't wait in the dark between trees without shifting their weight. I've requested transfer. I hope whoever reads this has better constitution than I do. Be careful of the trails that don't appear on any map. There are paths here that develop on their own, and if you follow them you'll find you're not where you intended to be. Stay on marked ground. Stay near the cabin. Stay." The entry ended mid-sentence, the pencil having pressed so hard into the paper that the lead broke through to the reverse side. I read those words while standing at the cabin table as the light from the eastern window fell across the page. And I made a decision. I closed the journal without reading further entries. Some information is better acquired through experience than through the testimony of people who couldn't handle it. I was hired because I could handle it. That was the unspoken agreement. The cabin was my territory now, and these mountains were my responsibility, regardless of what moved through them when the sun went down. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace to take the dampness out of the air and to establish a sense of control over the space. I cooked a simple meal of canned stew on the propane stove. I lay on the cot with my service revolver on the table beside me and listened to the sounds of the forest as darkness came down. The sounds were normal at first. Wind moving through the hemlock boughs, the settling of the cabin structure, the distant calling of a whippoorwill. Then, around midnight, the temperature inside the cabin dropped significantly. I watched my breath become visible, but the fire was still burning well and the doors were sealed. The cold came from no direction I could trace. It moved through the room like something intelligent, pooling in the corners, gathering near the ceiling. That was when I heard the vocalization from the lake. It wasn't a sound any animal in these mountains makes. It was too complex, too layered. If I had to describe it, I would say it sounded like a coyote learning to speak backwards, the pitch rising and falling through frequencies that made my teeth hurt. It came from the water, then moved into the woods, then seemed to spiral up and away toward the ridge above the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I maintained the fire and kept my hand near the revolver and told myself that all wilderness areas produce sounds that seem inexplicable until you understand their source. Elk bugling, panthers screaming, wind moving through rock formations. All of it could be explained if you had enough information. By dawn, I had almost convinced myself of this. The mountains around the cabin turned gold with the sunrise, and the forest looked like something from a postcard. I made coffee and checked the shortwave radio. Station chatter from other parts of the park came through clearly. Reports of hikers on the main trails, weather conditions, routine maintenance updates. Everything was normal. Everything was ordered. Everything suggested that what I had heard in the night was simply something I didn't yet understand. But the cabin was still cold, and no fire could warm the specific coldness that had moved through it. That coldness remained for 3 more days. By early May, I had settled into the rhythms of the place. I spent my days maintaining the trail, removing winter deadfall, checking the markers that guided people toward the lake. The work was physical and absorbing, which was what I needed. At night, I read the Ranger's Journal from 1998, one entry at a time, each passage revealing more about what the previous keeper had experienced. The hikers arrived on the 10th of May. I had climbed the ridge above the cabin to work on a section of trail that had been partially obscured by rockfall, and I saw them while I was surveying the damage. 2 of them, moving slowly up the trail with the deliberate pace of people who didn't know how much distance remained before their destination. I watched them through my binoculars, and took note of the fact that neither of them was carrying sufficient water or emergency supplies. By the time I descended and reached the cabin, they were already at the lake. I found them at the water's edge, sitting on rocks and discussing the quality of the views. The woman's name was Margot. She was in her early 30s with the kind of fitness that came from serious trail running. The man was introduced to me as Gregory, and he was perhaps 5 years older, with a camera around his neck and that particular enthusiasm for natural features that people sometimes brought to mountain areas. They had hiked up from the main park entrance that morning, a full vertical mile of climbing done in 4 hours. "We weren't sure there would be a ranger station," Margot said, smiling in a way that was meant to be charming but came across as slightly manic. "We wanted to check on the trail conditions." I explained that the trail conditions were acceptable, though I cautioned them about the unmarked paths that sometimes developed in the area. I offered them water and told them about the shelter further up the ridge if they wanted to extend their trip. They thanked me and seemed content with their answers, and I returned to the cabin, but I watched them from the window as they explored the lake's shoreline, and I noticed that they stayed only until the light began to change. By 5 o'clock, they were packing up their gear. By 5:30, they were gone, moving back down the trail toward the distant parking area. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt an odd tension that didn't release until I heard them reach the first major switchback below, the one that required a full 10 minutes of walking if they maintained any kind of pace. The journal entry I read that night was dated August 1998 and discussed a pair of hikers with similar descriptions. According to the previous ranger, they had come during the late afternoon and had left the trail at the point where it descended most steeply. They had never reached the parking area. A search was mounted the following day, but the hikers were never found. Their vehicle remained at the trailhead for 3 weeks before Park Services towed it. The entry said something I will never forget. "Sometimes the mountains give back what they take. Sometimes they don't." As May turned to June, I began noticing the animals more carefully. Not the normal populations, the deer, the elk, the occasional black bear that moved through the lower elevations. I noticed the animals that moved at odd angles to their normal behavior. There was a family of gray jays that lived near the cabin. I had been feeding them scraps of suet left behind by previous rangers, and they had become almost tame. One afternoon, I found all of them dead on my porch, arranged in a perfect line facing east, their necks bent at angles that couldn't have occurred naturally. There were no signs of predation, no blood, no obvious trauma. They were simply arranged and gone. The deer that appeared at the edge of the clearing started exhibiting behavior that I had no context for understanding. They would stand perfectly still for hours facing the cabin, not drinking from the stream that ran nearby, not grazing. They simply stood and faced the structure where I lived. When I went outside to investigate, they didn't flee. They waited until I was within 50 yards, then moved into the woods with an almost mechanical gait that made me think of things that had been taught how to walk like deer without truly understanding the process. And there was the sound I began to hear nightly, starting around the 3rd week of June. It came from multiple points around the cabin, sometimes from the lake, sometimes from the ridge, sometimes from the dense forest to the south. It was a vocalization that almost sounded like human speech. Almost. If human speech were being produced by something that had learned the sounds without understanding their meaning, something that was practicing the noise of human language the way children practice bird calls, it never resolved into actual words. It never became clear enough that I could identify specific syllables, but it was distinctly vocal, distinctly intentional, and distinctly not matching any animal I had ever encountered in any environment. I increased my patrols and began keeping better records. I noted the times of the vocalizations, the direction they came from, the sequence of sounds. I was documenting something, though I wasn't sure what I was documenting or who would ultimately read my findings. On July 3rd, I found the deer. It was positioned in the clearing perhaps 200 yards from the cabin, and I noticed it while I was checking the rain gauge as part of my weather monitoring duties. The animal was a doe, and it was clearly dead, but there was no obvious cause of death that I could determine from a distance. I approached cautiously, aware that dead animals in remote areas could attract predators, and I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. The closer I got, the more wrong the animal became. It wasn't simply dead. The positioning of its limbs suggested that it had been arranged after death, positioned on its back with its legs extended in 4 directions like a compass. Its eyes were open and beginning to cloud, which suggested the death had occurred within the past several hours. But what stopped my breath when I reached the body was the realization that its back had been opened with surgical precision. The hide was split along the spine, peeled back carefully, and the muscle beneath had been similarly separated. The organs were intact. I could see the lungs, the heart, the complex maze of intestines still in their proper positions. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been taken. The animal had simply been opened with a precision and deliberation that no other animal in this region could manage. I stood over that deer for a long time without moving. And then, because I understood that the proper response was to document what I had found, I took photographs with the camera I had been given as part of my equipment. The light was poor, and the images came out slightly blurred, but they were documentation. They were proof of a thing that didn't fit into normal categories. I buried the deer that evening, digging a hole deep enough that predators wouldn't easily disturb it. And I wrote in my journal, "This was done by intelligence. This was done by intention. This was done with purpose." The vocalizations increased in frequency after that. Every night the sounds came from multiple directions. They seemed to be testing something, probing the limits of what I would tolerate. Some nights they came so close to the cabin that I could hear them even through the sealed doors. A layered sound like multiple voices speaking in harmonic dissonance, each one trying to approximate human speech but failing in unique and unsettling ways. I began sleeping less and monitoring more. I maintained constant visibility toward the forest. I increased my inventory of ammunition and cleaned my revolver every evening. I was preparing for something, though I couldn't articulate what I was preparing for. I only knew that the sounds were becoming more confident, that whatever was producing them was learning something about me, about how I responded, about the limits of what the Ridgekeeper was willing to tolerate. By mid-July, 3 more hikers had come to the cabin and moved to the lake. I documented each visit in the journal. I warned each group about the dangers, about the unmarked paths, about the importance of staying on established trails. 2 of the groups ignored my warnings or didn't take them seriously. One group, a couple in their 60s, took me quite seriously indeed. "There's something wrong here," the woman said. Her name was Vivian, and she worked as a psychiatrist in Asheville. She had the kind of intuition that comes from years of listening to people describe experiences they couldn't fully explain. "I can feel it. There's something in the air of this place that's actively hostile." I didn't contradict her. I gave them supplies and advised them to turn back, but they didn't. They descended to the lake with the same determination as the others, and they returned to the cabin the next morning, pale and silent. They didn't speak about what they had seen. They packed their gear and left, moving down the trail with a pace that suggested something had frightened them sufficiently to overcome the normal caution that comes with descending steep terrain too quickly. I never received any report about them. No search was mounted, no inquiry came from the Park Service asking about their condition. This suggested to me that whatever had frightened them was something they understood implicitly should not be reported, something that fell outside the categories of normal wilderness incidents. The vocalizations came every night now, and they were no longer distant. They circled the cabin, moving around the perimeter with what seemed like deliberate strategy. Sometimes I heard them at the window. Once I heard something attempting to turn the doorknob, a scratching sound that lasted for nearly 3 minutes before ceasing. I increased my weapons readiness. I moved the cot so my head was against the wall, giving me full visibility of the room while I slept. I kept the revolver loaded and positioned within arm's reach. I maintained detailed notes about the vocalizations, their timing, their intensity, the apparent intelligence behind them. On July 23rd, I found the hiker. His name was Marcus, according to the driver's license in his waterlogged pack. He had registered at the trailhead parking area the previous evening, a solo hiker planning a one-day trip to the lake. His body was in the water at the southern edge of Blacksnake Lake, caught among submerged rocks where the inlet stream entered. I retrieved him using the small aluminum canoe that had been maintained by previous rangers, and I brought him to the cabin wrapped in emergency blankets. He had been in the water for at least 12 hours. His body was cold, his skin already showing signs of the decomposition that comes with water exposure. But he hadn't drowned. His lungs, when I examined him as thoroughly as my non-medical training allowed, were full of air. He had been placed in the water after death, arranged face down in a position that would ensure he was found eventually. A message left for the Ridgekeeper. This was undeniable. This was a crossed line. This was a thing that required response. I radioed the station at the park's main office and reported a deceased hiker. I provided the basics: location, condition, estimated time of death. The dispatcher's voice came back through the speaker with professional calm, asking for specific details and confirming my qualifications to assess death. We established that the body needed to remain undisturbed until the recovery team could reach the cabin the following afternoon. I spent the night with Marcus's body, which I had moved into the cabin and placed on the table. I covered him with blankets and positioned myself in the chair across the room. I kept the revolver in my lap and watched the body and listened to the sounds that came from outside, sounds that had changed in character now. They were no longer vocalizations. They were the sounds of something moving through the forest with apparent deliberation, sounds of branches being deliberately broken, sounds of something testing the structural integrity of the cabin by applying pressure to the walls. These sounds continued all night. They were systematic and patient. They were sounds produced by something that understood that a boundary had been crossed but was not entirely ready to accept the consequences of that crossing. The recovery team arrived at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. They were professional and practiced, asking minimal questions, taking the body with the kind of respectful efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first recovery of a body in a remote location. I watched them load Marcus into a body bag and carry him back down the trail, and I felt something shift inside my understanding of the situation. These deaths were known. These incidents were expected. The recovery procedures were too smooth, too practiced, for this to be an anomaly requiring investigation. This was part of the function of the post, part of what the Ridgekeeper position was designed to accommodate. August arrived with a heat that made the cabin's interior almost unbearable. The vocalizations had stopped completely after Marcus's recovery, replaced instead by a silence that was somehow more disturbing than the sounds had been. I maintained my routines, checked the trail, monitored the weather patterns, and waited for what seemed inevitable. By the second week of August, I had come to understand that the creatures, whatever they were not animals in the traditional sense. They were not hunting for food or territory. They were not responding to normal ecological pressures. They were intelligent, deliberate, and operating according to a set of rules and behaviors that existed entirely outside normal wilderness dynamics. Vivian, the psychiatrist, had been right. The hostility was in the air itself, embedded in the elevation and the trees and the water. It was not something that could be fought with conventional tools. It was something that could only be managed, contained, accepted. I found the message on August 14th, carved into the oldest hemlock near the cabin, carved in letters that must have taken hours of careful work to create. The letters were deep, cut through the protective bark into the wood beneath. They read, "The Ridgekeeper watches. The Ridgekeeper allows. The Ridgekeeper does not deny." I stood before that inscription for a long time, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel since arriving at this place. Clarity. I had accepted the job because I had needed to disappear, but I had actually accepted the job because something in me recognized what this place required. Someone who could look at impossible things and not demand explanation. Someone who could witness a breach of natural law and respond with documentation rather than denial. Someone who had himself done things that couldn't be easily categorized. The vocalizations returned that night, closer than they had ever been, moving directly through the cabin itself. But I did not respond with fear or aggression. I sat at the table with my journal open and I wrote, "The boundary holds because the Ridgekeeper does not deny it. The boundary holds because recognition is the price of safety. The boundary holds because we all understand that there are rules to be maintained. Laws deeper than state regulations, a natural hierarchy that reserves certain territories for certain entities. I am the Ridgekeeper. I will maintain this boundary. I will do this job without asking for understanding, without demanding explanation, without pretending that what occurs here can be categorized by conventional science. The mountains gave me refuge. The mountains kept me hidden. The mountains ask in return only that I maintain the fiction of normalcy while acknowledging the reality of what dwells here. This is the agreement. This is the covenant. This is the price of the Ridgekeeper. As I wrote these words, the sounds outside began to change. They became less urgent, less probing. They took on almost a tone of recognition, of acknowledgement. Something was settling. Something was accepting that I understood the terms. The morning brought silence, actual true silence, the kind of silence that means the presence of things at rest rather than things in hiding. I walked to the tree with the carved inscription and placed my hand on the letters. The wood was warm to the touch, even though the morning was cool. The warmth felt like acceptance, like an understanding that had moved beyond words into something deeper. I have maintained this post for 18 months now. No other hikers have attempted the trail since July. The ranger station knows not to send anyone to relieve me. The supplies are brought in by a specialized team that arrives once monthly and asks no questions about the condition of the area. They leave food, fuel, and ammunition. They take the journal when it's full and replace it with a blank one. I have learned to hear the vocalizations differently now, not as threats but as verification, a nightly confirmation that the boundary remains. I have learned to read the behavior of the animals, to understand that they are scouts and messengers, that the mountain is speaking through them to anyone patient enough to listen. The deer still position themselves at the clearing's edge sometimes, standing in their measured way, their eyes reflecting light that doesn't come from any visible source. I have stopped trying to explain these things. I have stopped looking for rational categories to fit them into. The Ridgekeeper accepts. The Ridgekeeper maintains. The Ridgekeeper does not deny. And in the cold months when the snow comes down and the lake freezes and the vocalizations become layered and complex enough to almost approximate actual speech, I sit in the cabin with my journal and I record what is occurring because documentation itself is a kind of maintenance, a way of acknowledging that these things are real, that they have occurred, that they will continue to occur. This is the function of the Ridgekeeper. This is the job I came here to do. This is what it means to understand that some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend normal explanation, and that someone must stand on the line between the world that knows how to explain things and the world that simply does what it does without requiring permission or understanding. I am that someone. I am the Ridgekeeper, and I will maintain this post as long as it requires me to remain.